There's a Ferrari sitting in a temperature-controlled vault in Northern California that hasn't made a sound in 60 years. 14 of the most celebrated restoration specialists in the world have spent 11 days trying to change that. They have failed, every single one of them. And in 48 hours, collectors and journalists from 4 continents will arrive expecting a miracle. But the miracle isn't coming from any of them. It's coming from the man pushing a mop down the hallway outside. A man nobody bothered to learn the name of. This is the story of Elias Moreau, and it starts with a little girl's hair clip on a concrete floor. If this story already has your attention, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let's get into it. The first thing you noticed about Black Ridge Motor Vault was the silence. Not the comfortable kind, the kind you get in libraries or late-night diners after the last customer leaves. This was a different silence, pressurized, almost hostile, the kind that collects in rooms where too much money is sitting next to too much anxiety. The vault occupied a converted aircraft hangar 40 minutes north of Napa, tucked behind a private road with no signage and a gate that didn't open unless you were already expected. The building had been climate-controlled to 58 degrees year-round, humidity held at a precise 42% by a system that cost more to install than most people's houses. Inside, 47 automobiles sat on polished concrete under soft museum lighting, each one representing some chapter of motorsport history that the rest of the world had either forgotten or never known about in the first place. The collection belonged to a man named Graham Ashford. He was 63 years old, had made his money in logistics infrastructure, the unglamorous business of moving things from one place to another efficiently, and had spent the last 20 years converting that money into something he considered more permanent. He wasn't a racer. He'd never been one. But he understood objects that were built to perform at the edge of what was physically possible, and he respected them in the specific way that people respect things they can't fully explain. He walked through the vault most mornings before his staff arrived, coffee in hand, moving slowly past the cars the way you might walk through a museum when you have it to yourself. He didn't touch anything. He just looked. The 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO occupied Bay 14 near the back of the building, positioned under a single overhead light that made it look almost theatrical, almost staged. The car was the color of dried blood, not the bright red most people associated with Ferrari, but a deeper, older shade, the kind that came from Italian paint mixed in small batches and applied by hand in a factory that no longer existed. The body was original, the chrome was intact, the leather on the 2 seats had cracked and softened in ways that told you exactly how many decades had passed since anyone sat in them. 3 of these cars had sold at auction in the past decade for prices that required a second sentence to explain. Graham's wasn't for sale. It had never been for sale. He'd bought it from an estate in Lyon 14 years ago after a 2-year negotiation, and the day it arrived in this building was one of the 3 or 4 days in his adult life he could say without qualification had been genuinely good. He wanted to hear it run. That was all. Not to race it, not to drive it across the Nevada desert, not to show it off to anyone. He just wanted to hear the engine turn over one more time before he got too old to appreciate the sound. He'd scheduled an unveiling event, a private gathering of collectors and automotive historians, 42 people total, tickets not sold but offered by invitation only, for the 3rd Saturday of October. That gave his team 14 days to get the car running. He'd hired 14 specialists to make it happen. Their names meant something in the world of vintage automotive restoration. 3 of them had worked on racing cars displayed in museums in Stuttgart and Turin. One was a former Formula One engineer who'd transitioned to preservation work after a career that ended with a team championship and a knee injury that never healed right. 2 were brothers from outside Bologna who had spent their careers working specifically on Ferrari 512 engines from this exact era, who communicated with each other in a rapid Bolognese dialect that no one else in the room could follow. There was a woman from Vancouver named Petra Stanholt who held 2 patents on carburetor cleaning processes and had been written about in 3 different automotive publications. There was a man from London named Marcus Webb who wore a wristwatch that cost more than the average American's annual salary and spoke in the quiet, unhurried way of someone who had never once been told he was wrong. Marcus Webb was the one Graham had heard about first. He was what people in this world called a name. The kind of professional whose involvement in a project was itself a form of validation, a signal to everyone else that whatever was happening here was serious. He'd been flown in on Graham's charter and given the largest workspace in the vault, a rolling cabinet of tools that had been shipped ahead of him, and the implicit understanding that he was running the show. He accepted all of this without comment, which itself communicated something. The other 13 specialists had arrived over the first 2 days, each one assessed and mentally ranked by the others within hours of introduction. This is what happens when you put highly accomplished people in a room together with a problem none of them has solved yet. The hierarchy reassembles itself almost immediately, with minimal conversation through a series of small signals: who stands closest to the car, who speaks first, who the others glance at when something new is said. By the end of day 1, everyone in Bay 14 understood the order of things, even if no one had said it out loud. 11 days later, the car still wasn't running. All right. The operations director was a man named Callum Riggs. He was 41, had come from a background in luxury event management, and had been hired by Graham 3 years ago to run the day-to-day logistics of the vault: staff scheduling, vendor relationships, the calendar of inspections and maintenance that kept 47 rare automobiles in displayable condition. He was good at his job in the way that people who are primarily concerned with appearances tend to be good at things. Everything looked right. Everything was on time. Everything was documented. The vault had never been cleaner or better organized than it was under Callum. He just didn't know anything about cars. This would not have been a problem if he'd been comfortable with that fact. He wasn't. Callum moved through the vault with the authority of someone who believed that knowing the names of things was equivalent to understanding them. He used the correct terminology. He referred to the 250 GTO's engine as the Colombo-derived V12. He could tell you the bore and stroke from memory. He could explain the difference between the 1962 and 1963 specifications if you gave him 30 seconds. He'd learned all of this from books and from listening to specialists talk, and he deployed it in conversations with the ease of someone who'd never been challenged on it. Graham trusted him with operations. He'd made the mistake, gradually, of also trusting him with judgment calls. By day 11, Callum was spending most of his time in Bay 14, watching the specialists and occasionally interrupting them with questions or observations that made some of them visibly clench their jaws. That evening, around 8 o'clock, after most of the team had broken for dinner, the overnight maintenance staff came in. There were 3 of them. A woman in her 50s named Darlene, who handled the administrative offices and the guest bathrooms. A young man named Tomas, who did the exterior grounds work and loading dock. And Elias Moreau, who swept, mopped, and handled whatever needed handling in the main vault floor from 8 in the evening until 4 in the morning, 5 nights a week. He was 44 years old, medium height, lean in the way of someone who'd spent years doing physical work, with hands that were notable if you looked at them. Wide across the knuckles, marked with old scars, the kind of hands that had done something specific for a very long time. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and a quiet face that didn't telegraph much. He'd worked at Blackridge for 2 years. Nobody on Callum's daytime staff had asked him a single personal question in that time. He was the overnight janitor. He came in, did the work, and went home to his daughter. His daughter was 5 years old and her name was Nora. She had her father's eyes, dark and steady and watchful in the specific way of children who have learned to pay attention to the world rather than demand things from it. She was small for her age, with brown hair that she insisted on wearing in 2 uneven braids that never quite matched, and she had a collection of small gear-shaped hair clips, 4 of them bought from a craft store 2 years ago, that she rotated through with the seriousness of someone managing an important inventory. She wore them every day, in various configurations, and she had strong opinions about which clip went on which side. Elias brought her to work on Thursdays. This was an arrangement he'd worked out with Graham Ashford directly, back when he was hired. Thursdays were the day his neighbor Mrs. Pelletier had her standing card game, which ran late, and there was no one else to watch Nora in the evenings. Graham had said yes without much deliberation. He'd met Nora once, briefly, during the hiring conversation, and had noticed the way she looked at the cars, not with the performed enthusiasm children sometimes show adults, but with genuine private interest, the way you look at something when you're not aware anyone is watching you look. He'd thought about that afterward. He wasn't sure why. On the evening of day 11, Elias arrived at his usual time with Nora beside him. She was wearing her denim jacket with the iron-on patch of a crescent moon on the back, carrying a small canvas tote bag with a picture book and a packet of crackers and a tiny flashlight she'd become attached to for no reason she could explain. She walked with her hand in her father's until they were inside the building, at which point she let go and fell into the loose, half-distracted pace of a child who's comfortable in a space. Bay 14 was still lit. 3 of the specialists had stayed late. The brothers from Bologna and Petra Stanholt, who was crouched near the front of the car with a penlight, studying something in the engine bay. The tools were spread across 2 rolling carts and a portable workbench. The Ferrari sat in the center of it all, hood open, looking patient in the way that inanimate objects can sometimes seem when everything around them is agitated. Elias steered Nora gently toward the far end of the vault, away from the work area, where he'd set up a folding table with a small plastic chair for her on previous evenings. She settled into it without complaint, pulling out her picture book and arranging her crackers in a specific pattern on the tabletop that made sense to her and no one else. He went to get his cart. He was coming back down the main aisle, running through the order of his usual tasks. The service corridor first, then the bathrooms off the lounge, then the vault floor once the specialists had cleared out. When Callum came out of the lounge with a cup of coffee and stopped, he looked at Nora, then he looked at Elias. "She's here again," Callum said. "Thursday," Elias said. "I'm aware it's Thursday." Callum's voice had the flat precision of someone who was keeping their tone professional and wanted you to know it was costing them something. "I've mentioned before that we're in a sensitive phase with the restoration. We have specialists working late, we have equipment everywhere, and we have a liability situation if a child—" "She stays at the table," Elias said. "She knows the rules." "I'm not questioning what she knows. I'm questioning whether a work environment with active mechanical restoration is an appropriate place for a 5-year-old at all." He paused. "Frankly, Elias, I think it might be worth reconsidering the arrangement." Elias looked at him for a moment without speaking. "I'll speak to Mr. Ashford about it," he said. "That's fine." Callum took a drink of his coffee. "In the meantime, keep her back from the work areas. These men didn't fly across the Atlantic to trip over a child's toys." He walked back toward the lounge. Elias stood for a moment with his hands on the cart handle. Then he resumed walking. At some point during the evening, it was past 9, the Bologna brothers had gone back to their hotel. Petra Stanholt was the last specialist left, and she was packing her case. Nora got up from her table. This wasn't unusual. She'd stand up sometimes to stretch, walk a short circuit around the area she was allowed in, occasionally come find her father to ask him something. But this time she walked further than she was supposed to, moving slowly down the outer edge of the vault, running her fingers lightly along the barrier rope that separated the display area from the walking path. She wasn't supposed to go past the barrier. She knew this. She stopped at Bay 14. The Ferrari was 10 feet away from her, across the rope. The hood was still up, held by a support rod, and the engine was visible, 12 cylinders in a V configuration. Manifolds and carburetors and fuel lines running in patterns that a person with no training could still recognize as precise and intentional. The car sat very still under the overhead light. The only sound in that part of the building was the climate control system, a low and constant breath moving through the ducts. Nora looked at the engine for a long time. She tilted her head to one side, the way she did when she was thinking about something carefully, and then she said quietly to no one in particular, to the car, maybe, or to the air, "It's waiting for the right hands." She stood there another moment. Then she turned and walked back toward her table. As she went, one of her gear-shaped hair clips, the copper-colored one, the one she favored, slipped loose from her braid and fell to the concrete floor without making a sound she heard. She didn't notice. She sat back down at her table, picked up her book, and continued reading. It was Petra Stanholt who almost stepped on it on her way out. She stopped, looked down, crouched, and picked it up. She turned it over in her fingers. It was the size of a large coin, stamped metal, shaped like a gear with 9 teeth. She set it on top of the nearest tool cart, meaning to mention it to someone, and then forgot entirely because her phone rang, and it was her partner calling from Vancouver, and she got into the conversation and walked out carrying her case. The clip stayed on the cart overnight. By day 12, the atmosphere in Bay 14 had shifted from tense to something harder to name. It wasn't that the specialists were giving up. No one had said anything like that, and the word failure wasn't in any of their vocabularies in any professional context. But there was a quality to the morning that felt different from the days before. People were moving more carefully, speaking more quietly, spending longer periods just standing and looking at the engine without touching anything. This is what exhausted expertise looks like. It's not chaotic. It's still and controlled and slightly hollow. The problem, as Marcus Webb had stated it on day 3 and restated several times since, was a starting and fuel delivery issue with one or more of the 3 Weber carburetors. The engine would turn over. The starter was functional, the battery was new, the ignition system had been thoroughly inspected and tested, but it would not catch. It would make the sounds that preceded ignition without completing the sequence. Marcus had described this with some confidence as a richness problem in the mixture, likely caused by needle valve wear in the float chambers, exacerbated by decades of varnish buildup in the passages. The carburetor components had been sourced, cleaned, replaced, in 2 cases, custom fabricated to period-correct specifications by a machinist in Modena who'd been handling parts for classic Italian racing cars for 40 years. The work had taken 6 days. When it was done and the engine was reassembled and they turned the key again, the result was identical to what it had been before. Marcus had stood with his hands in his pockets for approximately 90 seconds after this, looking at the engine. Then he'd said, "We start again," and everyone had gone back to their tools. On day 12, they were on their 3rd iteration, the same fuel delivery theory, addressed from slightly different angles. Callum moved through Bay 14 every hour or so, checking in, asking questions that Marcus answered in monosyllables. Around 11 in the morning, Graham came down from his office. He had a second-floor mezzanine space that overlooked the main floor, where he handled correspondence and calls, and stood at the edge of the work area without saying anything. He watched for about 10 minutes. Marcus didn't acknowledge his presence, neither did most of the others. Graham walked back toward the lounge, and on the way he noticed something on the corner of a tool cart. He stopped. He picked it up, turned it over, a gear-shaped clip, copper-colored, 9 teeth, the kind a child might wear. He looked at it for a while. He thought about the evening 2 years ago, when he'd first met Elias Moreau, and the interview had gone on longer than expected because Nora had spent the entire time staring at a 1969 Porsche 908 in the corner of the vault as if she were trying to memorize it. He thought about how she'd walked in last Thursday evening with her 2 mismatched braids and her tote bag, and how she'd looked at the cars the way he looked at them when he was alone. He put the clip in his pocket. The day went on. 3 specialists had a lengthy and at times heated discussion near the workbench about Weber needle jet specifications. The Bologna brothers disagreed with each other in fast Italian about float chamber depth settings. Petra Stanholt spent 2 hours in the lounge with her laptop running through digitized documentation from a Ferrari factory archive that she'd accessed through a researcher in Turin. Marcus Webb sat on a stool next to the car for most of the afternoon, not touching anything, just looking at the engine from different angles the way a chess player looks at a board. At one point in the afternoon, Callum addressed the assembled team in Bay 14 with a speech that he'd clearly thought about beforehand, expressing confidence in the group and the importance of the timeline, which did not go over the way he intended. Marcus looked at him for a moment after he finished, with the expression of someone who has decided that the most effective response is no response, and went back to looking at the engine. At 4 o'clock, Marcus told the team they were breaking for the evening. He said this with finality. A few people pushed back slightly. There was a suggestion from one of the Germans that they keep going. But Marcus's authority in the room was such that the pushback dissolved quickly, and within 40 minutes the specialists had cleared out, leaving Bay 14 quiet and lit, and the Ferrari still in its position with its hood still up. Callum stood at the edge of the bay for a moment before turning off the secondary overhead lights and heading upstairs. Graham Ashford came back into the vault at 6:30. He'd had dinner alone in his apartment above the administrative wing, soup, bread, half a glass of wine that he didn't finish, And he'd sat afterward in the chair by the window and thought about the phone calls he was going to have to make if October arrived without a running engine. Not about money, about something harder to articulate. The particular disappointment of a thing you've anticipated for a long time failing to become real. He walked through the vault slowly, the way he did in the mornings, but it felt different in the early evening with the specialist team gone. Quieter, more honest somehow. 47 cars sitting in the low light, each one a specific moment in automotive history held still against time. He stopped at Bay 14, stood outside the rope barrier and looked at the Ferrari. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the clip there, the small gear shape with its 9 teeth. He stayed there for a few minutes, then he went to find Elias Moreau. Elias was in the service corridor behind bays 20 through 25, running a dust mop along the wall when Graham found him. Nora was not with him tonight. It was a Wednesday. And so he was moving at his regular pace, methodical and quiet, the kind of man who'd made his peace with solitary work a long time ago. He looked up when he heard Graham. "Mr. Ashford," he said. He stopped the mop. Graham held up the clip. "I found this on the tool cart in Bay 14 this morning. I think it belongs to Nora." Elias looked at it. He smiled a little, the kind of smile that doesn't make a production of itself. "She's going to be upset. That's her favorite one." "I thought so." Graham held it out and Elias took it, turned it in his fingers, slipped it into his shirt pocket. Graham stayed where he was. He said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Have you been in Bay 14 at all while the specialists have been working?" A pause. "I clean the floor after they clear out for the night." "So you've been near the car?" "I've been near the car." "And?" Graham said. Elias looked at him. He had the expression of someone who was doing a fast calculation, weighing something, and Graham recognized it because he'd seen it before in people who had learned to be careful about what they said in professional settings. Not deception, caution, different thing. "What are you asking me?" Elias said. Graham said, "I'm asking if you have any thoughts about the engine." The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds. In the context of that conversation, in that corridor, it felt longer. "You've got 14 specialists out there," Elias said. "Smart people, experienced people. I don't think what they need is a janitor's thoughts." "Maybe not," Graham said, "but I'm asking anyway." Another pause. Elias looked down at the floor, then back up. "I haven't said anything because it wasn't my place to say anything. I'm making it your place." Elias studied him for a moment. Then he said, "Can I look at the engine? Properly. Not while I'm cleaning." "That's why I came to find you," Graham said. They walked together to Bay 14. Graham unclipped the barrier rope and let it drop, and Elias walked up to the Ferrari the way you approach something you know well, without the cautious hesitation of a stranger. He stopped a foot from the engine bay and put his hands in his pockets and just looked for a minute. Then he leaned in, braced one hand on the fender, gently, with the automatic care of someone who understood what he was touching, and looked more closely at the carburetor bank. He didn't touch anything yet. He just looked. Then he straightened up. He looked at Graham. "Can you try to start it?" he said. Graham looked at him. "Just turn it over," Elias said. "I want to hear something." Graham got into the driver's seat. The cockpit was narrow, designed for a man in a racing suit with no margin for comfort, and he sat forward on the bare leather and reached for the key that the specialist kept in the ignition between sessions. He turned it. The engine turned over. The starter cranked through its cycle. The engine made the sounds, the mechanical sounds of compression and timing, that preceded ignition without completing it. Graham let the key go. Elias stood for a moment without speaking. Then he walked to the left side of the engine and crouched down, getting his eyes level with the bottom of the carburetor assembly. He stayed there for nearly 30 seconds. Then he stood up. "The carburetors have been reinstalled wrong," he said. Graham got out of the car slowly. "Wrong how?" "The float bowl orientation on the center unit is reversed, maybe a quarter turn off, and the needle jet height is wrong by about 0.5 millimeter. It's not pulling fuel the way it should." He paused. "It's been wrong since before your team got here, I think. This might have been wrong for a long time." Graham looked at the engine. "Marcus Webb examined those carburetors for 3 days." "I know. Elias said it without any particular inflection. And he missed this. Elias didn't answer right away. He looked at the carburetor assembly again, then back at Graham, with the expression of someone about to say something they've been deciding whether to say for a while. "How long has Marcus Webb been here?" he asked. 12 days, Graham said. "What's he charging you?" Graham named a figure. Elias was quiet for a moment. "You should know that I can hear when people are in the vault at night," he said. "The building carries sound. I'm in the corridor and I can hear conversations in the bays if it's quiet enough." He stopped. "About 6 days ago, I heard Marcus Webb in Bay 14. He was on the phone. He was talking to someone about another job. He mentioned a collection in Geneva, said he'd be able to get there by the end of October at the latest." He paused again. He said, "And I want to be clear about what I actually heard. He said that the Blackridge job was going to take as long as it needed to take." The silence in Bay 14 after he said this was of a specific texture. Graham stood very still. "You heard this 6 days ago," he said. "Yes." "And you didn't say anything." Elias looked at him directly. "I'm the night janitor, Mr. Ashford. Who was I going to say it to?" Graham was quiet for a long time. He looked at the Ferrari. He looked back at Elias. "I need you here tomorrow morning," he said, "when the team comes in." Elias nodded once. 8 o'clock, Graham said. "I'll arrange it with Callum." Elias picked up his mop from where he'd left it against the wall. "Mr. Ashford," he said. Graham turned. "Don't tell anyone I'm coming, or why." Graham considered this for a moment. "All right," he said. He walked back toward the mezzanine stairs, his hand in his pocket where the hair clip had been, and he thought about a 5-year-old girl standing at the rope barrier in the quiet vault, tilting her head to one side and saying to no one in particular that the car was waiting for the right hands. He thought about that for the rest of the evening. Bochas. At 8:53 that night, Elias Moreau finished his shift. He locked his cart in the maintenance closet, signed out on the paper log at the service entrance, and walked to his truck in the parking area. He sat in the driver's seat for a while before starting it. He hadn't asked Graham Ashford why he'd come to find him, or what had made him think to ask a janitor about a Ferrari engine in the first place. He knew the answer, though, without being told. You spend enough time paying attention to how things work, and you get a sense for when someone else is also paying attention. Graham walked through this vault every morning the way Elias walked through it every night, slowly, without performing interest, taking it in because it meant something to him. That was enough. He started the truck and pulled out of the lot and drove home through the dark toward the small house where his daughter was already asleep, where her 3 remaining gear clips were lined up on the dresser beside her bed, where the books and the flashlight and all the ordinary materials of her specific life were organized in the quiet way of a child who had made her own peace with the world mostly working out, as long as her father came home. Elias parked the truck and sat a moment longer. Tomorrow morning. He thought about the engine, the float bowl orientation, the needle jet height, the particular sound the starter made when it tried and failed to catch. He thought about what his hands knew about this kind of work, and had not forgotten, even across all the years, all the distance he'd put between himself and it. He thought about his grandfather's shop, the smell of it, the long afternoons. He got out of the truck and went inside. The alarm went off at 5:45, same as every morning, and Elias reached over and silenced it before it had finished its second cycle. He lay there for a moment in the dark, looking at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Through the wall, he could hear Nora breathing in that slightly ragged way she sometimes did in deep sleep, a small congested sound that had alarmed him when she was an infant and that he'd since come to find reassuring, proof of presence. He got up and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window while it was still dark outside. He hadn't slept well. Not badly, exactly. He hadn't lain awake churning through things. But the sleep had been shallow, the kind where you're aware of time passing even when you're under. He'd been in and out for most of it, and when he was out, his mind had gone somewhere he hadn't visited in years. Not a memory precisely, more like a feeling. The particular quality of attention required for close engine work, the way everything else in your field of awareness shrank down until there was only the mechanism in front of you and the information your hands were sending you. He'd lived inside that feeling for a significant portion of his adult life, and then he'd stepped out of it, and he hadn't expected to feel it pulling at him again from the outside. He drank his coffee. He thought about what he was going to say when he walked into Bay 14 in front of 14 specialists who had spent 12 days on a problem he believed he could solve in a few hours. He didn't land on anything particularly good. He figured he'd work with whatever came up. At 6:15, he woke Nora. She was not a difficult child to wake. She came up out of sleep with the abrupt alertness of someone who'd decided there was no point in resisting it. But she was quiet in the mornings until she'd had a few minutes to organize herself. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her 3 remaining clips on the dresser. "The copper one fell out last night," Elias told her. She looked at him. "Where is it?" "Mr. Ashford has it. He'll give it back to me today." She considered this with the gravity she brought to all clip-related developments. "Okay," she said after a moment. She picked the small silver one and clipped it into her right braid. He dropped her at school at 7:40, stood outside the car for a moment while she went in through the gate without looking back. She'd decided recently that looking back at drop-off was babyish. And then he drove north on the 29 toward Black Ridge. He'd been asked to arrive at 8. He got there at 7:52 and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes. Through the narrow window beside the vehicle entry door, he could see that the overhead lights in the main vault were already on. He could see movement. He got out and went in. The specialists had been there since 7:30. This was not unusual. Several of them had been starting early for days, either out of genuine urgency or out of the particular anxiety of people who are paid well to do something and cannot do it. Marcus Webb was at the workbench when Elias came in, studying a page from a spiral notebook. The Bologna brothers were at the far end of the bay, talking to each other in low voices. Petra Stanholt was crouched in the same position she'd been in the night before, near the front of the car, though whether she'd made any progress from that position was impossible to know. Callum was by the tool cart. He saw Elias come in and his expression went through a specific sequence. Recognition, then a kind of blankness, then something harder. "Elias," he said. "Morning," Elias said. "What are you—" He stopped himself. "Mr. Ashford asked you to come in this morning?" "He did." "For what reason?" Elias said, "You'd have to ask him." Callum looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who understood, in the abstract, that there were things he didn't have authority over, and found this understanding uncomfortable. Then he turned and went to find his phone. Graham came down from the mezzanine at 8:03. He was wearing a collared shirt rolled to the elbows, and he was carrying his coffee mug, and he had the look of a man who hadn't slept much either, but who had made a decision and was not planning to revisit it. He stopped at the edge of Bay 14 and looked at the assembled group. Most of them had noticed Elias by now, and were paying that particular kind of not quite looking attention that people pay to things they haven't yet decided how to categorize. "Morning," Graham said to the group. Some of them returned it, some didn't. Marcus Webb looked up from his notebook. "We're about to start a new assessment of the needle jet configuration," Marcus said. "I think we were close yesterday on the flow. I want to do something different this morning," Graham said. Marcus waited. Graham said, "I'd like Elias to take a look at the engine." The silence that followed this was not long, but it had a texture. Petra Stanholt stood up from her crouch. One of the German specialists, a man named Brauer, who had so far said almost nothing to anyone outside his own language group, looked at Elias and then back at Graham as if he might have misheard. The older of the Bologna brothers turned his head with a kind of slow precision. Marcus Webb said, "I'm sorry?" "Elias Moreau," Graham said. "He's been on the overnight maintenance team here for 2 years. I'd like him to examine the engine." He paused. "That's it. That's the whole thing. I'm not asking anyone to stop their own work. I just want him to have a look." Marcus closed his notebook. "Graham," he said, with the patience of someone explaining something they'd thought was already understood, "we've had 12 days on this engine with 12 of the most experienced Ferrari restoration specialists in the world. If there's something we're missing, I don't think—" 14, Graham said. "Excuse me?" 14 specialists, not 12. You and 13 others. He said it without heat. "I want him to look at the engine." Marcus held his gaze for a moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and stood back from the workbench with a gesture that managed to be both cooperative and contemptuous at the same time. The kind of gesture that says, "Be my guest," while making absolutely clear what it thinks of the guest. Callum, who had come back into the bay during this exchange, was standing near the secondary tool cart, with his phone at his side and his face carefully arranged into the neutral expression of someone pretending to be comfortable. Elias walked up to the Ferrari. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't introduce himself or explain what he was doing or offer any preliminary remarks. He stood in front of the engine bay and looked at it for a while, the same way he'd looked at it last night. Calmly, without urgency, the way a person looks at something they've already thought about and are now confirming. Then he put his hand in. Bare hands, no gloves, which made Brower take a quiet breath through his nose, and touched the center carburetor. He wasn't doing anything yet, just touching. "Can someone start it?" he said. Nobody moved for a second. Graham looked at Petra Stanholt. She crossed to the driver's side, opened the door, got in, and reached for the key. She turned it. The engine went through its cycle. The starter cranked. The compression sounds came in sequence. It didn't catch. Petra released the key. Elias stood with his hand near the carburetor assembly, still not quite touching it. He had his eyes half closed, which gave him the appearance, from a certain angle, of someone who was listening rather than looking. "Again," he said. Petra started it again. Same result. Elias stood up. He turned around and looked at Marcus Webb. "The float bowl on the center carb is mounted backwards," he said. It came out flat, stated, not as an accusation. "About 20 degrees off from where it should be, and the needle jets in all three units are sitting high. Not much, 0.5 millimeter, maybe a fraction more. But the combination means you're getting a fuel-air ratio that's too lean at starting speed and too rich once it gets above 2,000 RPM, assuming it ever got that far." He paused. "It's never going to start like this. Doesn't matter how many times you try." The bay went quiet. Marcus Webb didn't move. "We replaced those carburetors," said the younger Bologna brother. His name was Dino, and it was the most he'd said in English in 2 days. "We replaced them and the float bowls and the needle jets. All of it." "I know," Elias said, "but the center unit was put back in backwards. It's easy to do on this model. The bowl's nearly symmetrical. You almost can't see it unless you're looking for it. And the needle height, whoever set that was going off a spec sheet. The correct height for this engine, at this altitude, with this fuel formulation, is about 0.5 millimeter lower than what the spec says." He looked at the engine again. The spec was written in 1961 for Italian fuel at sea level. It doesn't translate exactly. Another silence. Brower walked to the front of the car and leaned over the engine. He looked at the center carburetor for a long time. He straightened up and said something to the older Bologna brother in Italian that nobody else caught, and the older brother leaned in and looked, and then he stood up and said quietly, to no one in particular, "Cazzo." Marcus Webb had not moved from his position near the workbench. His face was controlled, professionally controlled, the way a person looks when they've trained themselves not to let their expressions move without permission. But there was something happening in it. Not anger exactly. Elias had expected anger, or something performing as anger. What he actually saw was harder to read, something older, something that looked, if he was being honest about it, a little like recognition. "Who are you?" Marcus said. It was a strange question, because Marcus knew who he was. Everyone in the room had been introduced to the building's overnight maintenance staff during the first week, a brief and entirely formal acknowledgement. But Elias understood that wasn't what he was asking. He said, "My name is Elias Moreau." "That's not what I mean." "I know it isn't." The two men looked at each other across the engine bay. "Where did you train?" Marcus said. "I didn't train," Elias said. "I apprenticed. My father and my grandfather before him. 30 years of it, starting when I was about 13. Apprenticed where? Everywhere they would have us. A restoration shop outside Lyon for a while. A private collection near Modena for several years. Some work for individual owners." He paused. "I spent 2 years specifically on Colombo-derived V12S Ferrari and 1 or 2 of the Lamborghinis before Ferruccio sold the company." The older Bologna brother said something in Italian to his brother. His brother responded. The first said in English, "Who was your master in Modena?" Elias said the name. The older brother went very still. He said, "Bruno Caretti?" "Yes." The older brother looked at his younger brother. Something passed between them. He looked back at Elias with an expression that had shifted considerably from a few moments before. Bruno Coretti died 10 years ago, the older brother said. 11, Elias said. I heard a few months after. We'd lost touch by then. He was... The older brother stopped. He seemed to be deciding how much to say. He was the best I ever saw on these engines, in my opinion. I studied with him briefly in 1987, before you probably. Probably, Elias said. Petra Stanholt was looking at Elias with the particular expression of someone who has been solving a puzzle and has just found the piece that explains the picture. Why are you working here as maintenance staff? She asked. She wasn't being unkind. It was a genuine question, asked with the directness of someone who thought the most respectful thing you could do was ask the thing you were actually thinking. Elias said, I have a daughter. The schedule works. It was the simplest answer and also the most complete one, and something about the plainness of it moved through the room without needing to be unpacked further. Callum said from his position near the cart, even if what you're saying about the carburetors is correct, that doesn't explain why 12 days of 14, Graham said again without looking at him. Why 14 days of expert work missed something so basic, Callum finished. Elias didn't respond to this directly. He looked at the engine. It's easy to miss if you're not looking for it specifically, he said. The bowl looks right from above. The orientation mark is small and easy to read wrong if you're working in this light with magnification. And the needle jet issue. I only know the correct spec because someone told me years ago what the factory setting actually was versus what went into the documentation. It was one of those details that got passed down in person rather than on paper. He paused. Most people working from the manuals wouldn't know it. And you do, Callum said. And I do, Elias said. There was a break while the immediate argument about methodology ran itself out. This was inevitable. 12. 14. People with strong technical opinions and professional self-regard, faced with the suggestion that they had missed something fundamental, cannot all simply nod and move forward. The Bologna brothers went back and forth in Italian at some volume. Brower consulted his own notebook with the intensity of someone who's checking their work after being told they might have gotten an answer wrong. Petra Stanholt photographed the center carburetor with her phone, both to document what Elias had pointed to and probably to have something objective to look at when her own instincts were complicated by the social dynamics of the room. Graham stood at the edge of the bay and watched all of this without intervening. Callum came and stood beside him. He said quietly, I think you should have told me you were planning this. I was planning it at 10 o'clock last night, Graham said. You were home. I could have been reached. I know. I chose not to reach you. Callum was quiet for a moment. These are people with international reputations, Graham. If it comes out that you bypassed their process to ask the overnight cleaning staff, then it comes out, Graham said. If he's wrong, and we go back to what we were doing. If he's right, then we find out what 14 very expensive people missed, and we know more than we did. He looked at Callum. Either way, I want to know. Callum said nothing further. In the center of the bay, Marcus Webb was still at his position near the workbench. He hadn't joined the conversation with the others. He was just standing there looking at the engine with the expression of a man who was working through something privately. Elias was near the front of the car, not engaging with the ongoing debate. He'd said his piece. He understood that this part, the arguing, the checking, the slow organizational process of a group of experts arriving at an uncomfortable conclusion, had to happen at its own pace. He'd been in rooms like this before, a long time ago. The people were different, the cars were different, the specific dynamics were different, but the essential human architecture was always the same. Expert pride was a specific and powerful force, and you didn't get around it by pushing, you just had to wait for it to run down. He waited. He looked at the car while he waited. Not at the engine now, at the body. The lines of it. The particular shape of the hood curve and the stance of the rear haunches and the way the whole thing seemed to be leaning slightly forward, even standing still, like an athlete in the last moment before movement. He'd seen pictures of this model when he was 12 years old in a book his grandfather kept on a shelf in the shop. a French automotive encyclopedia from the early 1970s, its spine held together with tape, its pages soft from handling. He'd looked at those pictures for hours. His grandfather had caught him at it once and had come and stood beside him without saying anything, and they'd looked at the pictures together for a while, and then his grandfather had said, "That's the best they ever did, before or since." That's what happens when the engineers are still afraid of what they're making. He thought about that now. He thought about his grandfather's shop, the low building at the edge of a small town in the Loire Valley, the corrugated roof that amplified rain into something almost symphonic, the smell of oil and metal, and the specific dry smell of old leather from seats that had been pulled and were waiting to go back in. His father had worked there with his grandfather until his grandfather's arthritis made fine work impossible, and then his father had carried the shop alone for another decade. And then Elias had come into it as a teenager and discovered that whatever gift the work required, or whatever combination of patience and attention and physical intuition, he appeared to have it. He'd built a career out of it. A serious one, for a while. Not famous, not the way Marcus Webb was famous, but known within the specific world of vintage European racing car restoration in the way that people who are very good at something tend to become known by the other people who are very good at the same thing. He'd worked on cars that now lived in museums. He'd been called to consult on restorations in 4 countries. He'd turned down 2 job offers that would have been considered significant career moves because he'd wanted to stay close to the kind of work he wanted to do. And then Marguerite had gotten sick. He didn't let himself go too far down that road. Not here, not now. He'd learned, over the years since, to keep that particular sequence of events in a specific place in his memory. Accessible, not buried, but not casually revisitable either. She'd gotten sick, and then she died, and in the 18 months between diagnosis and the end, he'd watched Nora go from being a toddler who didn't understand what was happening to being a 3-year-old who understood slightly more than she let on. And something in that, the understanding in Nora's eyes, the specific quality of the way she watched him during those months, had reconfigured everything about what he considered important. He'd sold the van with the tools in it 6 weeks after Marguerite died. He'd kept the tools themselves. There were some you didn't sell. That would be its own kind of severance. But he'd put them in storage and moved with Nora to the small house and figured out what a life looked like when it was built around a different center of gravity. The night work had come through a connection, a former client who'd bought a collection and needed maintenance staff who were discreet and reliable. The hours were right. It kept him close to cars in a way that satisfied some part of the need without demanding the parts of himself he was no longer sure he could give. For 2 years it had been enough. He wasn't sure, standing in Bay 14 now, whether that was still the right word for it. Across the bay, the argument was winding down. Brower had gone quiet in the way that meant he'd checked whatever he was checking and reached a conclusion he wasn't happy about. The Bologna brothers were speaking in lower voices now, the high-temperature part of the exchange apparently finished. Petra Stanholt was standing with her phone, looking at the photograph she'd taken, and she had the look of someone who has confirmed something they suspected and are now deciding what to do with it. Marcus Webb was walking toward Elias. He came and stood beside him in front of the engine bay. He stood there for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "The float bowl. Show me specifically what you're seeing." Elias leaned in and pointed to the orientation mark on the bowl housing, a small stamped indicator, barely 3 millimeters, that was supposed to align with a corresponding mark on the mounting flange. "It's rotated roughly here," he said, indicating the angle with his hand. "Maybe 22, 23 degrees, enough to affect the fuel feed at low RPM. Marcus looked at where he was pointing. He was quiet for a long time. "I saw that mark on day 4, he said. His voice was even, uninflected. He said it the way you might state a fact about weather. Elias turned to look at him. "I thought the mark was a manufacturing inconsistency," Marcus said. "This era, there were production variations. I've seen alignment marks that didn't correspond to anything meaningful." He paused. "I made a judgment call, and I moved past it." "All right," Elias said. Marcus looked at him. "That's it? All right?" "I don't know what else to say. You were working with a large amount of information, and you made a call that turned out to be wrong. That happens." "It doesn't happen to me," Marcus said. "It happened to you," Elias said. "Not cruelly, just accurately. Something moved in Marcus Webb's face. Then he said, and Elias would think about this afterward, about the specific cost of what Marcus said next. I knew by day 6 that we were going in circles. I knew we weren't getting closer. He stopped. He looked at the carburetor. I told myself it was the complexity of the problem. There are cases where the complexity is genuine. There are, Elias agreed. This wasn't one of them. He said it quietly. I had a call with a colleague on day 7 about a collection in Geneva. They'd been trying to reach me for weeks. I told them end of October that this job was going long. He paused again. By day 7, I had already turned down another engagement to be here. I was not eager to leave with nothing. The bay was quiet. Elias had the impression that some of the others could hear this, or had caught enough of the register of it to know that something important was being said, and were keeping their distance by instinct. And you didn't tell Graham, Elias said. No. You knew the car wasn't going to start with the carburetors the way they were, and you kept going. A pause. I told myself I still hadn't ruled out other contributing factors, and that was technically true. There could have been other issues. But you knew that wasn't the main problem. I knew, Marcus said, that the main problem was something I had already looked at and walked away from. He said this with a kind of flat precision, the way someone speaks when they've decided to be accurate even when accuracy is costly. It didn't read as remorse exactly. Marcus Webb was not a man who'd had much practice at remorse, Elias judged. But it was something, some version of a man looking at what he'd done without the cover story. Elias said, You should tell Graham. Marcus didn't respond immediately. You're going to tell him anyway, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. No, Elias said. That's your job. I'm here to fix the car. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he straightened up. He ran one hand along the edge of the fender. A small, almost unconscious gesture. The gesture of someone who was also, underneath everything, genuinely moved by what the car was. Then he turned and walked across the bay toward Graham Ashford. No. Elias didn't watch that conversation. He had no interest in it, and it wasn't his to witness. He turned back to the engine and started thinking through the sequence of work. The center carburetor would need to come off the intake manifold, which meant removing the fuel line connections first. There were 3, with the period-specific Italian clamp style, which required a particular angle on the driver to not damage the fittings. The bowl orientation would then be correctable by loosening the mounting bolts, rotating the unit to alignment, and retorquing to spec. The needle jet adjustment in all 3 units would require partial disassembly, unscrewing the top covers, removing the pistons, resetting the needle height with a gauge. It was not complicated work. It was painstaking, specific work that required calm hands and patience and the ability to operate at a very small scale without hurrying, but it was not technically complex. In the right hands, he thought it could be done in 4 hours. Less, maybe, if no one bothered him. He looked up. Petra Stanholt was standing a few feet away watching him. Can I ask how you know the correct altitude spec? She said. For the needle jets. My grandfather told me, Elias said. He worked on a car like this, not identical, a slightly earlier model, for a collector in Burgundy. The collector had been through 2 other mechanics, and neither of them could get the car running reliably above 1,500 meters. He called my grandfather in, and my grandfather found the same issue. But at that time, he didn't know the correct spec either. He had to figure it out empirically, running the engine at different settings until it was right, and then he wrote it down. He paused. He gave me a small notebook when I started working on V12S. His notes were in it. Do you still have it? I have it. She looked at him with the same expression as before, the puzzle piece expression. You've been mopping floors for 2 years, she said. I've been raising my daughter, he said, with a slight correction in his tone that wasn't defensive, just precise. She accepted this. I'd like to watch, if that's all right, while you work. That's fine, he said. You don't mind? I never minded people watching, he said. My grandfather always said if you're ashamed to be watched doing a thing, you're either not doing it right or you shouldn't be doing it at all. She nodded. Then she said, The 2 of us figured this out around the same time. The orientation mark. I saw it last night going back through my photographs. I was going to raise it this morning. Elias looked at her. He wasn't sure what she wanted him to say. I'm telling you that in case it's useful, she said. I'm not telling you so that you'll think better of me. I appreciate it, he said. He turned back to the engine and began. Shut. On the far side of the bay, Graham Ashford and Marcus Webb were having the conversation that Marcus had decided to have. Graham had not changed his expression while Marcus talked. This in itself was notable. Graham was a man whose face generally communicated what he was thinking, at least in broad strokes, and the fact that it wasn't moving now suggested that he was expending specific effort to keep it still. He listened to Marcus go through it with the same flat accuracy he'd used with Elias, the same absence of performance. When Marcus finished, Graham stood for a moment. 11 days, Graham said. Yes. You kept 11 specialists employed on a problem that had already been identified. I told myself I hadn't fully... Marcus. Graham said his name in a way that closed that sentence. I'm not interested in what you told yourself. I'm asking what you did. I kept the engagement running, Marcus said. I knew the issue and I let the others continue working around it. Graham looked away from him, across the bay, to where Elias Moreau was bent over the engine with a fuel line driver, moving with the slow, deliberate care of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. He looked back at Marcus. The rate you're charging, he said. Yes. You understand that we're going to have a different conversation about that. I expected that. What I'm more interested in, Graham said, is why you're telling me this now. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He gave me the option, he said, of telling you myself. Graham looked at Elias again. Something in his face that might have been something like gratitude, though it sat alongside a complicated set of other things that weren't as easily named. All right, Graham said. He said it the same way Elias had said it, just accepting the fact of it and deciding to move. He looked at Callum, who was standing 20 feet away, pretending not to have been watching this conversation. Callum, he said, can you come here? Bolshim. The morning moved forward. Elias worked on the center carburetor with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this specific thing many times in a specific condition of the hands and the mind. Not mechanical, not routine, but settled, purposeful. He asked for tools when he needed them and stated what he needed specifically, and whoever was closest to the cart got them for him, which happened, over the course of the morning, to include both Bologna brothers, Brower, and eventually Marcus Webb himself, who came and stood near the work area and responded when Elias asked for the 12mm ring driver by finding it in the cart and holding it out without comment. This small exchange was observed by several people in the room, and no one said anything about it. Petra Stanholt stood to the side and watched, as she'd said she would. She asked occasional questions about the removal sequence, about how Elias was gauging the clamp tension by feel rather than a torque indicator, and Elias answered them straightforwardly. He didn't lecture, and he didn't simplify. He just answered what she asked. She wrote things in a small notebook. He noticed this and was quietly pleased by it, though he didn't say so. The other specialists watched or didn't watch according to their own dispositions. The older Bologna brother had come and looked at Elias's hands while he worked for a few minutes with an expression that Elias couldn't entirely read. Respect, maybe, and something that might have been grief or nostalgia or whatever you called it, when you saw a method you recognized from someone who was no longer living. Callum had not come back into Bay 14 after his conversation with Graham. Elias didn't know what that conversation had contained. He focused on the work. By 11:30, he had the center carburetor back in place, oriented correctly, fuel lines reattached and checked. He had reset the needle jet in the center unit and was halfway through the same process on the left unit. He straightened up briefly and looked at the engine from above. He could see it already, the way it would work, the sequence of events when fuel and air found their correct proportions and the mixture caught. He'd seen it in his mind earlier this morning, in the kitchen before dawn, the same way he used to see things when he was deep in this kind of work. Not imagined exactly, more like recalled from a future that had already been determined by physics. The engine wanted to run. That was the thing about a well-made machine. It had an intention, an original purpose that didn't go away just because decades had passed and circumstances had changed. You just had to give it back what it needed. He bent back down and continued. Well, Graham came and stood at the edge of the work area at noon. He watched for a few minutes. Elias was finishing the right carburetor unit now, his hands moving at the same unhurried pace they'd held all morning. "How much longer?" Graham asked. 30 minutes, Elias said. "Maybe 40. Then it should be ready." Graham nodded. He started to move away, then stopped. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced the copper gear clip and set it carefully on the edge of the tool cart. "For Nora," he said. Elias glanced at it. "Thank you." Graham stayed another moment. "She's not wrong, you know," he said. "What she said? Last night?" Elias looked up at him. "About the hands," Graham said. He left it there and walked back toward the mezzanine stairs. Elias picked up the clip and put it in his pocket alongside the work. He'd give it to her at pickup. She'd be relieved. She'd probably inspect it for damage and find none, and then clip it carefully back into the rotation, and by tomorrow morning the 4 clips would be lined up on the dresser again in whatever order made sense to her. He went back to the carburetor. He thought about his grandfather's notebook. He thought about the low building in the Loire Valley, and the sound of rain on the corrugated roof. He thought about how he'd sat next to his grandfather for the first 2 years of his apprenticeship and done nothing but watch, because his grandfather had said that the eye learned before the hands did and that you couldn't rush the sequence. He thought about the day his grandfather had finally let him touch an engine, not to work on it, just to hold a component, a carburetor very similar to the one he was working on now, and had said, "Tell me what your fingers are finding." He had tried to describe it. His grandfather had listened without interrupting. When he finished, his grandfather had nodded slowly and said, "Good. You're listening. Most people never learn to listen." That was 27 years ago. He was listening now. He finished the right carburetor, replaced the top, checked the fuel line connections one final time by feel, running his fingers along each fitting. He stood up straight and looked at the engine. He looked at everything. The whole assembly, the carburetor bank, the manifolds, the ignition leads, the timing components that had been checked and rechecked by the other specialists, and that he had examined himself during the process and found correct. He looked for anything that felt wrong, any detail his eyes or his hands were flagging. Nothing flagged. He stepped back. He looked around the room. Most of the specialists were still there, plus some had gone to lunch but had come back or hadn't gone at all. Graham had come back down from the mezzanine. Even Callum had returned, standing near the corridor entrance with his arms crossed, his face carrying the complicated expression of someone watching something they don't know how to evaluate. Elias said, "Start it." The words dropped into the room simply, without theater. 2 words. The same words he would have said in his grandfather's shop, in any of the collection garages he'd worked in over the years, with no more ceremony than they carried. Petra Stanholt was the one who moved to the driver's side. She opened the door, she got in. She looked at Elias once across the engine bay, and he gave her a small nod, and she reached for the key. She turned it. The starter engaged. The engine turned over. The compression sounds built in sequence, and this time, instead of trailing off into the silence of failure, they found something, a catch, a stutter. Then a deeper sound, something that built from the base of the machine and came up through the floor and the metal and the air in the room, a sound that was partly mechanical and partly something else, the sound of 60 years of intention finally meeting its moment. The V12 came alive. It didn't roar, it didn't thunder, it sang. There was no better word for it, even though the word sounded like the kind of thing you said in a car magazine and didn't mean. It was a specific sound, unmistakable. The voice of 12 cylinders precisely balanced and breathing correctly for the first time in decades, a sound that went into your sternum and stayed there. Elias stood with his hands at his sides and listened to it. The room was quiet around the engine. 14 specialists, a collection owner, an operations director, none of them said anything. Some of them looked at the car. Some of them looked at Elias. Some of them looked at the floor. Petra Stanholt sat in the cockpit with both hands in her lap, not touching anything, listening. The engine ran. It was rough at first. Rough the way a voice is rough, when it hasn't been used in a long time. And then, as the oil found its passages and the fuel settled into its new delivery path, it smoothed. Not perfectly, not silently. It had 60 years of character in it, a slight roughness at the edges of each cylinder's contribution that was real and appropriate and would never be machined out because it was part of what the car was. But it ran. Elias reached forward and touched the edge of the engine housing with 2 fingers. Just touched it, feeling the vibration coming up through his fingertips the way he'd been trained to feel it, reading what the machine was telling him the way his grandfather had taught him to read it. It was telling him it was all right. He stepped back. Behind him, someone began to clap. It was the younger Bologna brother, Dino, starting slowly and then building, and then someone else joined in, and then more. The applause moving around the room in the particular way applause moves when it's not being performed, but is just happening, when the people doing it are doing it because they have to do something with the feeling they're carrying, and this is the available option. The engine ran on. Elias looked at it for another moment. Then he looked at his hands. A habit, something his grandfather had done after every finished job, a sort of accounting. The hands were unchanged. They looked the same as they'd looked this morning, last week, 2 years ago. Slightly scarred, wide across the knuckles, capable. The engine sang its old song to the temperature-controlled air of the vault, and Elias Moreau stood in front of it and felt, for the first time in a long time, the particular quality of completeness that comes when you have done the thing you were built to do. He thought about Nora. He thought about pickup at 3:15, the gate where she didn't look back anymore, the copper clip in his pocket. He thought, I should call, tell her it worked. She wouldn't fully understand what had worked, but she'd understand that her father had done something, and that it had come out right, and she would say, Good Dad, in that small certain voice she had, and that would be enough. For now, that would be more than enough. The applause died down the way it always does. Gradually, unevenly, a few people stopping before others, until it was just the engine left, filling the space where the sound had been. Petra Stanholt shut the ignition off after about 90 seconds. Not because anyone asked her to, but because 90 seconds was enough for the engine to prove itself, and the car didn't need to idle indefinitely while people processed what had just happened. She got out of the cockpit and stood beside the fender and looked at Elias. The way you look at someone after they've done something you're going to be thinking about for a while. The room reorganized itself slowly. People started talking again, first in pairs and then in small clusters, the way groups do when a shared experience has just concluded and everyone is sorting out what they think about it. Brower went immediately to his notebook. The Bologna brothers conferred with each other in the quiet, rapid way of people whose communication had compressed over decades into something close to shorthand. Some of the others pulled out phones, not to make calls, but reflexively, the way people reach for their phones when they're processing something and their hands need something to do. Marcus Webb hadn't moved from the edge of the work area. He'd been standing in the same position when the engine started, and he was still standing there now, arms crossed, looking at the front of the car. He wasn't processing it the way the others were. He was doing something different, though Elias couldn't have named exactly what. Settling into something, maybe. Accepting a set of facts he'd already accepted privately, but that had now been demonstrated publicly, which was a different kind of accepting. Graham Ashford came down from the mezzanine stairs. He'd gone up during the last 20 minutes of the carburetor work. Elias had seen him go, didn't know why, and he'd been on the mezzanine when the engine started. Elias had looked up and seen him up there, standing at the rail, and Graham's face at that distance had been unreadable, but his posture was the posture of someone who had just had something returned to them that they'd thought might be gone. He came across the vault floor now, moving at his usual unhurried pace, and he stopped in front of the car. He put his hand on the hood, not on the painted surface, on the edge, on the lip of metal where the hood met the body. He stood there for a moment. Then he looked at Elias. "Thank you," he said. Elias said, "It's a good engine. It wanted to run. It's been in this building for 14 years. It was always going to run," Elias said. "It just needed the right information." Graham looked at him for a moment longer, and Elias could see him putting something together, not deciding something, but confirming something he'd already decided, which was different. He nodded, once, the nod of a man who has reached a conclusion and is marking it for himself. Then he turned and looked across the room at Callum Riggs. Callum had come back fully into the bay when the engine started. He was standing near the wall now, and if you looked at him carefully, you could see that the equation inside him was being reworked in real time. 2 years of working in this building and his operating theory had been consistent, and he'd thought logical. Expertise lived in credentials, in professional reputation, in the kind of institutional validation that came from being hired to fly across an ocean and fix a historic car. It was a reasonable theory. It was the theory of almost every organization he'd ever worked for. The theory that held most professional environments together and kept the accountable parts accountable. You hired the named people, and the named people did the named thing, and the structure held. The structure had just developed a significant crack, and the crack had been made by a man who mopped floors and brought his daughter to work on Thursdays. Callum was smart enough to see it. He wasn't sure yet what to do with what he saw. Graham crossed the bay toward him. They met near the corridor entrance, and what followed was a conversation that Elias was not close enough to hear clearly, though the room had quieted and some phrases came through. He wasn't trying to listen. He was checking his work, running through the carburetor assembly one more time in his mind, asking himself whether there was anything he'd missed, any adjustment that would need to be revisited after the engine had more hours on it. There was one thing. The idle mixture screws would probably need a slight turn-in once the engine had fully warmed through, because the initial cold behavior sometimes masked a lean condition at idle that only showed up at operating temperature. He made a note of it. He'd mention it to whoever Graham designated to handle the follow-up. From across the room, isolated words reached him. Credentialed, judgment, should have been. And then Callum's voice, lower. I understand. Not defensive. Just quiet. Petra came and stood beside Elias. What do you need to do for the follow-up maintenance? She asked. Idle mixture screws, he said. Once it's fully at temperature, probably a quarter turn in on the center unit, maybe less on the outer two. And the whole thing should run for 30 minutes before you seal it back up, to give the oil a chance to reach everything. He paused. Someone should watch the temperature gauge. The thermostat was replaced, but it's new, and this era they sometimes seat slowly. I can do that, she said. You don't need to babysit it, Elias said. It's going to be fine. I'm just saying check it every 10 minutes. I know I don't need to, she said. I want to. He accepted this. She had the quality of someone who experienced machines the same way he did, which was not as objects but as systems with logic and preferences and the capacity, when treated correctly, to tell you something true about how the physical world worked. He'd known a few people like that over the years. Not many. It was a specific disposition and it couldn't be taught, only recognized and worked alongside. How long did you apprentice? She asked. 11 years in formal apprenticeship, he said. After that, it's just work. Who else besides Bruno Caretti? A man named Léon Vidal in Lyon first. He'd worked on Le Mans cars in the 60s and 70s. He was the one who sent me to Caretti. He said Caretti was the only man who knew what he knew about Ferrari 512S from that era, and that I needed to sit next to him for as long as he'd have me. How long did Caretti have you? 2 years and 4 months, Elias said. He wasn't an easy man to work for. He didn't explain things. He did them, and you watched, and if you missed something, he didn't go back. You had to ask, and he'd look at you and decide whether the question deserved an answer. He paused. Most of my questions didn't at first, but after about 6 months, more of them did. And after a year, he'd sometimes explain before I asked. That sounds difficult. It was exactly as difficult as it needed to be, he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, the needle jet specification, the altitude correction. You said your grandfather wrote it down. He did. That's not in any documentation I've ever seen on these engines. Not in the Weber service manuals, not in the Ferrari factory records. No, Elias said. It wouldn't be. He worked it out empirically. He ran the engine at different settings and marked down what worked and calculated backwards from that. The figure's correct. I've used it 4 times on this engine family, and it's been right every time. But it came from one man sitting in a garage in 1974 doing math on a notepad. He looked at the engine. That's where most of the real information lives. not in documentation, in notebooks and in people's heads, and when the people die, the notebooks are sometimes all that's left. Petra looked at the engine too. "I'd like to see that notebook," she said. "Maybe sometime," he said. And then, because she'd been straightforward with him all morning, and that deserved reciprocity, "Yes, I'll show it to you." Across the room, the conversation between Graham and Callum had concluded. Graham had returned to the center of the bay. Callum was still standing near the corridor entrance, but his posture had changed. The arms were no longer crossed. The carefully maintained professional neutrality was gone, replaced by something more exposed. He looked younger somehow, less armored. Graham said to the assembled room, "I want to say something." The clusters of conversation died down, everyone oriented toward him. "What happened today represents a failure on the part of this organization," he said, "not on the part of the specialists who were hired in good faith, but on the part of the management of this facility, which operated on a set of assumptions about expertise and qualification that led it to overlook a resource that was available here the entire time." He spoke at a steady pace, without looking at notes, the way he spoke in the logistical meetings that ran his business, plainly getting through the substance. "I take responsibility for not asking the right questions sooner, but I want to be direct about something else." He looked at Marcus Webb. Marcus returned the look steadily. "I was told this morning about a decision made during this project that compromised the integrity of the engagement," Graham said. He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. "I'll be addressing that directly and privately with the individual involved. But I want everyone in this room to understand that what happened today will change how this facility operates going forward. The person who solved this problem deserves to be recognized for it, and I intend to recognize it appropriately." Nobody spoke. Then the older Bologna brother, his name was Enzo, the room had learned over the days, said in accented English that he used rarely and carefully, "He should be introduced properly. We don't know who he is. Not properly." Graham looked at Elias. Elias looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. He wasn't comfortable being introduced, had never been comfortable with that particular form of attention, but he understood what Enzo meant and respected it. In the world these men came from, the world he had once occupied, you were introduced. You had a lineage. The lineage mattered because it was the only way to communicate a career's worth of accumulated knowledge in a single breath. "Elias Moreau," Graham said. "He trained under Leon Vidal in Lyon and spent 2 years with Bruno Coretti outside Modena. He's been doing restoration work on vintage European racing engines for nearly 30 years. He paused. He's also been working here for 2 years as our overnight maintenance team lead, which I should have asked more questions about a long time ago." Enzo nodded slowly, with the specific gravity of an older man who has just placed someone in a lineage he recognizes and is acknowledging the placement. He said something to his brother in Italian that sounded like confirmation, like checking a fact against memory and finding it correct. Brower looked up from his notebook. He said to Elias, in the flat and direct way that turned out to be simply how he communicated, "How many engines of this family have you completed?" "Fully," Elias said. 9. Partial restoration or diagnostic work, more than that. I stopped counting. Brower wrote something in his notebook. Marcus Webb asked to speak to Graham privately, which they did in the lounge off the main corridor. Elias didn't know what passed between them there and didn't need to. He spent the next 40 minutes at the car, running through the idle mixture adjustment now that the engine had reached temperature, making the small corrections he'd anticipated. Petra watched. She'd been right to stay. The center unit had been leaner than expected at idle and needed a third of a turn rather than a quarter, which was the kind of thing you couldn't predict and had to feel. The engine ran on. After the adjustment, it had a steadiness to it that it hadn't quite had at first, the roughness at the edges of each cycle smoothing to something more even. Not perfect. It was never going to be the kind of perfectly smooth that you got from a machine that had been rebuilt to modern tolerances with modern materials. This engine was 60 years old and intended to sound like it. The character was part of it. But it was right. It was doing what it was supposed to do. He let it run for the full 30 minutes and then shut it off. The silence afterward had a different quality than the silence before. It wasn't the pressurized silence of failure and waiting. It was the silence that comes after something is finished, which has a texture of its own, a kind of settling, the way a room settles after music stops. Elias cleaned his hands with a shop rag and put the tools he'd used back where they came from, organizing them on the cart with the automatic care of someone who'd learned early that the shop is only as reliable as the discipline you maintain in it. When he was done, he stood and looked at the engine bay one more time, and then he closed the hood. This took a moment. The support rod he discovered had a slight resistance in its socket that required a specific angle to disengage. He worked it out without forcing it, and the hood came down with a sound that was quieter than you'd expect from something that size. A precise, settled sound that came from 40 years of a body panel knowing exactly where it was supposed to be. He stood back. The Ferrari sat in Bay 14 exactly as it had sat for 14 years, under the single overhead light, looking patient. But something about it was different now. Had been different since the engine ran. It was hard to articulate, the kind of thing that made you feel slightly foolish trying, but there was a quality of completion to it. Like a conversation that had been waiting for the last sentence. Graham found him in the corridor outside the bay. "Come upstairs," he said. "When you have a minute." Elias followed him up the mezzanine stairs, which he'd never been on before. The mezzanine level held a narrow office with 2 windows that looked down over the vault floor, a desk with a computer and a phone, a small seating area with 2 chairs and a low table. Through the window he could see the vault stretched out below. Bay 14 in the lower left, the Ferrari's roof visible, the specialists beginning to pack up their equipment or drift toward the lounge for the afternoon. The perspective was strange and slightly vertiginous. He'd always seen this building from the floor. Graham gestured at one of the chairs and sat in the other one. "Can I get you something?" he said. "Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine," Elias said. Graham leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at Elias. "I owe you an apology," he said. Elias said, "For what?" "For 2 years of not asking a basic question," Graham said. "When I hired you, your reference listed automotive maintenance experience. I asked 2 follow-up questions, both of which were about schedule reliability. I didn't ask what that experience actually was." He paused. "I should have." "You hired a maintenance person," Elias said. "That's what the job was." "I know, but I walked past you in this building twice a week for 2 years and never bothered to find out who was working in it." He looked at the window, at the vault floor below. "That's the same mistake Callum makes. I've been telling myself it isn't, but it is." Elias didn't respond immediately. He sat with this for a moment. "People see what they're looking for," he said finally. "You were looking for someone reliable to keep the building maintained. I was that. There wasn't a reason to look for anything else." "Maybe," Graham said, "but Nora made me look. The clip made me look." Elias almost smiled. She'd be pleased to hear that. "She'd be more pleased to hear that she was right about the car," Graham said. "She was," Elias said. "She usually is." Graham looked at him more directly now. "I want to talk about what happens after this week," he said. "After the unveiling event. I've been thinking about the collection, this facility, and what it actually needs to be the kind of place I always intended it to be." He stopped, as if deciding how directly to say what he meant to say. "I have 47 cars that deserve the same attention that Ferrari got today. I have a building full of significant machines that are being maintained adequately, but not the way they should be. Not with the knowledge that the work actually requires." Elias looked at him. "I'm not going to make a speech about it," Graham said. "I want you to think about whether there's a role here that makes sense for you. Something that uses what you actually know. A different schedule, different title, different everything. I don't know exactly what the shape of it is yet, but I know I want you involved in it." He paused. "I also know you have Nora, and that your schedule is not incidental to your life, so whatever we build has to work around that." Elias was quiet for a moment. "I'd want to think about it," he said. "That's the right answer," Graham said. "Take the time you need." They sat for a moment without speaking. Through the window, on the vault floor below, Petra Stanholt was having a conversation with Enzo near the tool cart. Whatever they were discussing, she was nodding, writing something. "Marcus," Elias said. "Yes," Graham said. "What are you going to do?" Graham looked at the window. Financially, we'll settle on what the project was actually worth versus what was billed, which is a significant difference. Professionally, he stopped. He told you himself. He chose to tell me. I don't know what I think about that. I think it mattered that he did, Elias said. Why? Elias thought about it. Because he had a way out. He could have said he was continuing to investigate contributing factors right up until today, and today I showed up and it would have looked like I'd simply moved faster. Nobody in the room knew he'd identified the mark on day 4. He paused. He chose to say it. After you gave him the option, Graham said. Yes. But the option isn't the choice. Graham looked at him for a moment. You have a particular way of thinking about things, he said. I don't mean that as a small thing. My grandfather would say the work teaches you to see clearly, Elias said. You can't build a case for the engine. It either runs or it doesn't. He left the mezzanine at 2:15 and went downstairs to where his cart was still in the service corridor, exactly where he'd left it the night before when Graham had come to find him. He stood in front of it for a moment. He wasn't on shift. This wasn't his shift. And the cart was a strange thing to be looking at right now, slightly absurd in the context of the morning he'd just had. He left the cart and went to pick up Nora. She was waiting at the gate with 2 other kids who were also waiting for parents, standing slightly apart from them the way she sometimes did. Not unfriendly, but contained. When she saw his truck pull up, she came through the gate and got in with the economy of motion of a kid who's been picked up by the same person at the same place enough times that it's become entirely automatic. Hi, she said, buckling herself. Hi, he said. How was school? Okay. We did fractions. I already knew fractions. You told me. I told Miss Rodriguez too. She looked out the window as they pulled away. She said I was right, but also that I should let other people have a chance to figure it out. Elias said, Ms. Rodriguez is right. Nora considered this. The car, she said. Did it work? He looked at her briefly, then back at the road. Yeah, he said. It worked. She was quiet for a moment, then, I knew it would. I know you did. Because it just needed the right hands. It did, he said. She seemed satisfied with this and looked back out the window. After a while, she said, What did it sound like? He thought about how to answer this honestly. Like it had been waiting a long time, he said, and then it wasn't waiting anymore. She nodded, as if this was exactly what she'd expected. He reached into his pocket and produced the copper clip. She took it immediately, inspected it with focused attention, found no damage, and clipped it into her right braid with the seriousness of someone correcting a long-standing imbalance. All 4, she said, satisfied. All 4, he agreed. The unveiling event was 3 days away. In those 3 days, Bay 14 became a different kind of place. The atmosphere had shifted, not to celebration exactly, but to something more workmanlike. The urgency that had made the previous 12 days feel pressurized was gone, replaced by the ordinary energy of people finishing something properly. 2 of the specialists departed the morning after the engine ran. Both had other commitments, other collections waiting, but the remaining 12 stayed and put the time into secondary systems. Brake fluid flush, the cosmetic attention that the exterior body required after being handled by a dozen sets of hands over 2 weeks, a thorough inspection of the wheel bearings and suspension points by Brower, who turned out to be as meticulous about running gear as anyone Elias had worked alongside. Elias came in on his regular night shifts, but he also came in during the days at Graham's request, working alongside whoever was at the car, serving in a role that didn't have a title yet, but that everyone seemed to understand. He answered questions, checked the work being done by others, occasionally redirected approaches that were going in the wrong direction. He did this without authority and without ceremony. He just did the work that needed doing. Petra stayed through the week. On the second day, she came in with a copy of Bruno Coretti's obituary, translated from Italian, which had appeared in a small automotive historical journal in Milan 11 years earlier. She put it on the tool cart without comment and let Elias find it there. He read it twice, put it in his jacket pocket, and said nothing about it for the rest of the day. She didn't raise it. What the obituary said and he'd known most of it already from colleagues who'd reached out after Coretti's death, was that the man had been considered by many in the Italian restoration world to be the last genuine practitioner of a specific approach to Ferrari. 512 work that had originated with the factory engineers of the 1950s and early 60s. The approach was not systematic or documented. It was passed down person to person, modified slightly with each transmission, like a language that evolves through use. Coretti had reportedly taken on 3 long-term apprentices in his lifetime. The article mentioned 2 of them by name. Elias was not mentioned. He'd left Coretti's shop before the older man achieved the kind of retrospective recognition that attracted documentary attention. He'd left quietly, the way he did most things, and the world that paid attention to such things hadn't tracked him. He thought about this on and off over those 3 days. Not with bitterness. There wasn't bitterness in him about it, had never been, but with a kind of neutral awareness that something had slipped past the historical record that shouldn't have. Not because it mattered for him personally, but because the technique mattered, the knowledge mattered. If Coretti was described as the last practitioner of it and Elias hadn't been mentioned, then as far as that specific historical record was concerned, the lineage ended with Coretti. He knew it didn't. It didn't end. It had continued in him, through all the years of maintenance work and quiet evenings, and Nora growing up beside him in the small house with the 4 gear clips on the dresser. It had continued because knowledge like that doesn't stop existing, just because the person carrying it has stepped back from the professional world. It sits in the hands. It sits in the memory. It waits. He thought about his grandfather's notebook, which was in a box in the hall closet, under a winter coat and a pair of boots Nora had outgrown. He thought, it should not be in a closet, Brian. The night before the unveiling, Graham came back to him. It was 8:30 and Elias was in Bay 14, running a final inspection of the engine bay. His third, by that point, checking every connection one more time with the focused patience that was simply how he was built. The vault was mostly quiet. A few of the specialists would be returning for the event itself, but most of them had departed that afternoon. Graham came in, saw where Elias was, and came to stand near the front of the car. "Event's at 3 tomorrow," he said. "I'd like you to be here, not as maintenance staff, as I want to introduce you to the people who are coming." "I don't need to be introduced," Elias said. "I know you don't need to be. I'd like to." Graham paused. "Some of these people have been collecting cars for 40 years. They know the history. They'll know who Vidal was, who Coretti was. And I think they should know that that lineage is here, in this building." Elias straightened up and looked at him. "You want to be able to tell them the car was restored by someone trained in that tradition." "I want them to meet that person," Graham said. "There's a difference." Elias thought about it. He thought about tomorrow pick up at 3:15, which conflicted directly with a 3 o'clock event, and the fact that Mrs. Pelletier's card game was on Thursday, not Saturday, and he'd need to figure out coverage. He said, "I'd need to arrange something for Nora." "Bring her," Graham said, "to an event with 42 collectors and journalists." "She was here when this started," Graham said. "She should be here when it finishes." Elias looked at him. "She can stay with me," Graham said, "if you're comfortable with that. I'll keep her out of the way, but she can be here." Elias thought about Nora at the edge of the rope barrier 3 nights ago in the quiet vault. The way she'd stood there and said what she said to no one in particular and then gone back to her crackers without needing acknowledgement. "All right," he said. The morning of the event, Elias arrived at 6. The event team, a company Graham used for private gatherings, was setting up in the reception area and the lounge, and a photographer who'd been engaged to document the unveiling was moving through the vault taking establishing shots. The vault had been polished to a different standard than usual, the floors reflecting the overhead lights in long, clean lines. Bay 14 had been cordoned off with velvet rope and brass stanchions that looked nothing like the practical nylon barriers used day to day, which was either appropriate for the occasion or slightly absurd depending on how you looked at it. Elias ran his final check of the engine bay in the first hour before the event team was fully set up. He replaced the top of the center carburetor. He'd opened it one more time the night before to verify the needle jet hadn't shifted, and checked the fuel lines by touch for the last time. He closed the hood. He wiped a fingerprint off the driver's door glass with the corner of his shirt. At 9:30, Marcus Webb arrived. Elias saw him come in through the vehicle entrance, rolling a small case, and was briefly surprised. He'd thought Marcus had left 2 days ago. Marcus saw him at the same moment and crossed the floor toward him with the directness of someone who's made a decision about something. He stopped in front of Elias. "I told Graham I'd like to say something to the group today," Marcus said. "About the project, about what happened." He paused. "I wanted to tell you that first." Elias looked at him. "I don't require that," he said. "I know you don't," Marcus said. "I require it." There was something in this that Elias recognized, not the gesture of a man asking for forgiveness, which would have been about something else, but the gesture of a man who had understood a thing about himself and was choosing not to look away from it. That was different. That was harder, in some ways. "All right," Elias said. Marcus looked at the car. "It runs beautifully," he said. "Yes," Elias said. "I've been in this work for 23 years, Marcus said. "I've worked on 14 cars that are now in museums. I've had pieces published. I've been consulted." He said this not with pride, but with accounting, the way you list assets before discussing a deficit. "I have never made a mistake like this one." "You've never been in a position where the mistake was so costly to admit," Elias said. Marcus looked at him. "That's a generous reading." "It's an accurate one," Elias said. "The mistake itself is ordinary. These things happen. The extended part, the decision to keep working without saying anything, that came from something specific to this situation, specific to what this project meant for your reputation and your calendar." He paused. "You said so yourself." "I did." "Then you understand it, which means you can avoid it." "I'd like to think so," Marcus said. Something in his face shifted slightly. "You're more reasonable about this than I have any right to expect." "I got what I needed," Elias said. "The car runs. My daughter gets her clip back. That's the whole thing for me." Marcus almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "The girl," he said. "What she said. About the hands. Someone mentioned it. I don't know where she picked up the language." "From me, probably," Elias said. "I used to say something like it when I was teaching, that the machine recognizes when the right hands are on it. It's not literal. It's just a way of describing what it feels like when the knowledge is correct." "Bruno Coretti said something similar," Marcus said. "I met him once, a gathering in Milan, 2003. He barely spoke to anyone, but someone asked him what the key to this work was, and he said that the engine had memory and that the right hands reminded it of what it knew." Elias looked at him. "He said that?" he said. "In Italian. The person I was with translated it." Elias was quiet for a moment. He thought about Coretti's shop, the particular quality of silence in it, the way the man worked with a focus so intense it was almost physical, a presence in the room. He thought about how Coretti had said almost nothing about philosophy or approach or craft theory, had simply done the work and expected you to observe. And that made this second-hand report of a statement feel more significant, not less. It was the kind of thing Coretti would say once at a public gathering when asked directly, having never said anything like it to any apprentice ever. "The engine has memory," Elias said. "And the right hand's reminded of what it knows," Marcus said. They stood with this for a moment. Then Marcus said, "You should have a different business card," which was, given everything, about as close as Marcus Webb got to sentimentality, and Elias understood it for what it was. The guests began arriving at 2:30. 42 people, as Graham had said, though the number felt larger in the space. Collectors, historians, a few journalists from publications that covered vintage motorsport, 2 museum curators. They moved through the vault in the way people move through well-curated spaces. Slowly, in pairs or small groups, stopping at what arrested them and passing what didn't. Bay 14, cordoned off with its velvet rope, drew the most sustained attention. Elias stood near the back of the room for the first hour, slightly outside the main social current, watching. He was wearing what he'd decided that morning constituted an appropriate version of himself for an event like this. Clean dark pants, a collared shirt, actual shoes rather than work boots. Nora stood beside him for a while, holding his hand, conducting her own private assessment of the room. "There are a lot of old men," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because people who've been interested in something for a long time tend to be older." She considered this. "That makes sense," she decided. "Go with Mr. Ashford," he said. "He said he'd show you the Porsche in the corner." "I've seen it before," she said. "You've seen it from 30 feet away in the dark," he said. "Go." She released his hand and went, threading through the crowd with the straightforward navigation of a child who has not yet learned to move around adults apologetically. Across the room, Graham had caught his eye and was beginning to work his way toward him. Around the velvet rope at Bay 14, 4 people were having a conversation about the car. Its production history, its provenance, the specifics of this particular chassis number, and what documentation existed on its racing history before it left Italy. One of them, Elias noticed, was an elderly man who had arrived separately from the main group via what looked like a video setup in the corner. No, not separately. There was a screen there, a large monitor that the event team had positioned to one side, and on it was a video call. The man on the screen was old, clearly, an Italian, and he was speaking in careful Italian that someone beside the monitor was translating for the nearby guests in quiet asides. Graham reached Elias. "There's someone who wants to speak to you," he said. "On the screen." "Who is it?" "His name is Vittorio Marchetti," Graham said. "He's 91. He worked for Ferrari in the 50s and 60s. Engine development, the Colombo-derived V12 specifically. He's been in a care facility in Maranello for the past 3 years. His granddaughter set up the connection when she heard about the event." Elias looked at the screen across the room. "He knew my grandfather," he said. "Not a question." Graham said, "He said to tell you that Armand Moreau's son's son was the only person he would have trusted with that car." The thing about a statement like that, when it arrives from an unexpected direction, is that you're not prepared for it. And being unprepared means the feeling that comes with it reaches you before you can manage it properly. Elias stood for a moment, with it doing whatever it was doing inside him, and then he put it somewhere manageable and looked at Graham. "I'll go speak with him," he said. "He also said," Graham said, "that he heard the engine start. Someone played the recording over the call this morning. He said—" He paused, and something in his face showed that he'd felt the weight of what he was about to relay. He said that it sounded exactly right. Elias crossed the room. The monitor showed an elderly man in a chair, with the particular stillness of someone for whom movement had become effortful, but whose eyes were alive and tracking. He was watching Elias come toward the screen. He had white hair, neatly arranged, and a face that had been sharp in youth and had compressed into itself over decades without losing the sharpness entirely. He spoke in Italian, and his granddaughter, somewhere off camera, translated. "He says you have your grandfather's hands," she said. "He can tell from how you move." Elias stood in front of the monitor and looked at the old man on the screen. "Tell him," Elias said, "that my grandfather would be glad to know someone remembered." The granddaughter translated. Vittorio Marchetti looked at Elias for a long moment, then he nodded. He said something else in Italian that his granddaughter translated as, "The technique doesn't die, it only waits." He said one more thing. "He says the car sounds the way it did in 1962, the granddaughter said, "when they ran it the first time at the factory. He was there." Elias said nothing. He stood and looked at the old man on the screen, and the old man looked back at him, and between them, across decades and an ocean and every ordinary rupture that a life accumulates, something passed that neither of them would have been comfortable naming out loud. Marcus Webb, as promised, addressed the assembled group at 3:30. He stood near the velvet rope at Bay 14, in front of the Ferrari, and he spoke for about 4 minutes. He described the project in factual terms. He described the technical challenge and the approaches taken. He described the moment on day 12 when he'd asked to speak with Graham privately, and he described what he'd said in that conversation. He didn't soften it or complicate it. He said what he'd done and he explained why, and he said that the resolution of the project had come from a different source. He said Elias Moreau's name. The room was quiet when he finished. Some of the guests looked at Elias. Some looked at each other. A few looked at the car. Then the oldest of the collectors near the velvet rope, a German man who'd been introduced to Elias earlier as someone who'd been in this world for 50 years, who'd known Enzo Ferrari personally, raised his hand toward Elias with a small, deliberate gesture, a kind of salute. Not theatrical, just a precise acknowledgement from one person who understood the work to another person who had done it. Elias nodded at him. Then Graham moved to the Ferrari. He looked at the assembled room. He picked up a key, not the key that the specialists had used, the working key, but a key that had come with the car from Lyon, an original, on a small metal tag, and he offered it to Elias. "Will you?" Graham said. Elias looked at the key. He took it. He got into the car, which was narrow and direct and smelled of old leather and mineral oil, and he reached forward and put the key in the ignition and turned it. The V12 came alive. It filled Bay 14 and then the vault, and then it seemed the whole building. That specific voice, 12 cylinders in their V, running at the correct mixture at the correct temperature with the correct fuel pressure and the correct ratios for the first time in decades. It was rough at the edges and clean in the middle and unmistakable. A sound that had a specific place in the history of what human beings had been able to build and that almost no one alive had heard in this configuration coming from this engine. Elias sat in the cockpit with both hands in his lap and listened to it. He let it run for 30 seconds. Then he shut it off. He got out of the car and stood beside it and looked at it the way he'd been looking at it all week, trying to see it clearly, trying to account for what it actually was rather than what the mythology around it made it seem. It was a race car built 60 years ago by people who were trying to solve a specific engineering problem within specific constraints. It was also, in some way he could feel without being able to fully articulate, a record of what those people knew and how they thought. A physical memory. It sounded exactly right. Across the room, Nora had climbed up onto the bottom rail of the display barrier near the Porsche in the corner and was looking at the Ferrari from a distance with her chin propped on her hands and her 4 gear clips aligned in her braids. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking at the car. Elias watched her watch it. He thought about the technique that waited, about what it waited in and for how long and through what circumstances. He thought about his grandfather's notebook in the closet at home, and the notes in the margins that he'd spent years learning to read and longer learning to use. He thought about what Vittorio Marchetti had said through his granddaughter from a screen in Maranello. The technique doesn't die, it only waits. He thought, it waited in him, and before him, in his father, and before that, in the man who figured it out empirically in a garage in the Loire Valley in 1974 and wrote it down in pencil so that whoever came after would have it. 42 people were standing in this building looking at a Ferrari that ran. Elias stood beside it and felt the work in his hands and the quiet completeness of it and the particular weight of a thing done correctly in a world that didn't always require correct things or know how to recognize them when they happened. He felt all of this. And then he put it somewhere manageable, because his daughter was climbing a rail she wasn't supposed to climb, and he needed to go get her down. The guests began leaving around 5:30. They went in the order that people leave private events, first the ones with the longest drives, then the ones with early flights, then the ones who'd been there long enough to feel they'd received what they came for and were ready to carry it away. A few lingered near Bay 14, even as the event staff began quietly dismantling the catering setup in the lounge. The German collector who'd made the saluting gesture toward Elias earlier came and shook his hand before leaving. A firm, brief handshake, no speech attached, which was its own kind of statement. One of the museum curators asked for Elias's contact information, which Graham provided because Elias didn't have a card, and which Elias noted with a feeling he couldn't entirely identify, something between discomfort and quiet recognition. By 6:15, the vault was mostly empty. The event staff finished their breakdown and were gone by 7. The caterers had been in and out through the service entrance, and their departure left a specific kind of aftermath. The arrangement of chairs in the reception area, the lingering smell of coffee, and the little sandwiches that nobody had entirely finished. The vault itself looked the same as it always did. 47 cars under soft light, the climate control doing its constant, invisible work. Elias found Nora asleep in one of the lounge chairs. She'd fought sleep for most of the event with the silent, methodical determination she brought to not wanting to miss things. She'd sat with Graham for a while, then with Petra Stanholt, who'd shown her the photographs on her laptop, the carburetor documentation, which Nora had studied with the focused interest she brought to mechanical things. And then she drifted back toward the vault floor and apparently found the chair at some point in the last hour and surrendered to it. She was curled on her side with her jacket pulled over her like a blanket, both braids intact, all 4 clips still in place. Her small canvas bag was on the floor beside the chair. Elias stood and looked at her for a moment. Then Graham came into the lounge, saw the situation, and said nothing, just went to the small bar cart and poured 2 glasses of water and set them on the side table. "She's a sound sleeper," he said quietly. "Anywhere," Elias said. "She once fell asleep on a concrete floor in a hardware store." "Under what circumstances?" "I was talking to someone for too long. She decided not to wait." Graham sat in the other chair across the low table, and Elias took the seat nearest Nora without sitting fully back in it, the way a parent sits when a child is asleep nearby. Comfortable, but not entirely at rest, half of his attention always available to her. They sat for a while without talking, which was not uncomfortable. Graham was a man who seemed to understand that silence didn't require filling, which Elias had noticed and appreciated over the past 2 weeks. "Vittorio watched until the connection dropped," Graham said eventually, "about an hour after the engine started. His granddaughter said he wanted to stay until the guests were gone, but he fell asleep in the chair." Elias looked at his water glass. "He was there when that engine first ran," he said, "in 1962, and now he's in a care facility in Maranello, and he heard it again, from a screen." He paused. "That's a strange kind of continuity." "Not strange," Graham said. "Rare." Elias considered this. "My grandfather met Vittorio Marchetti once, a symposium in Laon, 1969 or 1970. He mentioned it in the notebook, not in the technical sections, at the end, in the part where he wrote things that didn't fit anywhere else. He said Marchetti was the only person he'd ever met who understood what the engine was trying to do on its own terms, not on the engineer's terms." Graham looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," Elias said, working through it slowly, "that most engineers approach an engine with a theory about how it should behave and then try to make it behave that way. My grandfather thought Marchetti was different. He said Marchetti started with the engine and worked backward, listened to what the engine was telling him it wanted to do, and then built the mathematics around that rather than the other way. And your grandfather worked the same way." "He tried to," Elias said. He said it was harder than it sounded, because the instinct to impose your theory is very strong. You have to train yourself out of it. He spent most of his career training himself out of it." He paused. "That was what he was trying to pass to me, not techniques, the disposition." Graham was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's what you did this week." "I listened," Elias said simply. "The engine was telling me what was wrong. It just needed someone to hear it." Nora shifted in the chair and made a small sound and then settled again. Elias glanced at her, then back at Graham. "I've been thinking about your offer," he said. Graham waited. "I have questions," Elias said. "Ask them." "The schedule? You said it would work around Nora. What does that actually look like?" "Whatever you need it to look like," Graham said. "I'm not asking you to be somewhere at 8 every morning. I'm asking you to take responsibility for the mechanical health of this collection and to apply what you know to it. When you do that and how you structure the time around it, that's between you and the work." "The other staff," Elias said. "Darlene, Tomas, my situation changes. Their situations don't. I don't want it to be awkward for them." "I'll handle that," Graham said. "Their roles are different from what I'm asking you to do. The distinction will be clear." "And Callum?" Elias said. Graham looked at him. "He and I had a conversation on the afternoon the engine ran," Graham said. "A longer one, after most of the specialists had left. We talked about what happened and about what kind of organization this facility needs to be." He stopped. "Callum is good at some things. He manages vendors well. He handles the administrative and logistical end with real competence. But he's been making judgment calls in areas that are outside his expertise, and he's been doing it with a confidence that wasn't earned." He paused again. "I told him that has to change. He understood. Whether he can change it, He left that unfinished in the particular way of a man who has been honest with an employee and is not yet sure how the honesty will land over time. He's not a bad person, Elias said. No, Graham said. He's a person who's been doing a job that was slightly larger than his actual qualifications, and nobody, including me, has ever pushed back on it. He looked at his water glass. That includes me pushing back on my own assumptions about who knows what in this building. Elias said, the collections. I walked through some of the technical documentation last week, what I could access from the maintenance files. Some of those cars haven't had anyone with real specific knowledge near them in years. There's a 1967 Lamborghini in Bay 9 that has, I could see from 10 feet away that it needs attention. I know, Graham said. Do you know what kind of attention? No, Graham said. Which is the point? Elias said, I'd want to do a full assessment, every car in the building from a mechanical standpoint, not cosmetic. The aesthetic maintenance is fine. Mechanically, I want to know what's actually in here and what state it's in. How long would that take? Properly? A few months? Some of these cars I'd need specialist input on. I'm not the right person for everything in here, and I want to be clear about that. But I can tell you what's needed, and in most cases, I can tell you who should do it. Graham looked at him for a moment. You're already thinking like the director of engine restoration, he said. Elias said, what would that mean, exactly? It means whatever we define it to mean, Graham said. It doesn't exist yet. I'd want your input on the definition. That's either very flexible or very uncertain, Elias said. Both, Graham said, without apology. Elias looked at Nora. She'd shifted again, and one of her braids had come loose at the bottom, the silver clip still attached, but the braid unraveling below it. He reached over and tucked the loose end back without waking her. I'll say yes, he said. To thinking about it seriously. I'm not ready to say yes to the thing itself yet. That's fair, Graham said. I need to talk to Nora. Graham looked at him with a slight expression of, not surprise exactly. Something more like recognition. She's 5, he said. She's 5, and her life is organized around my schedule, Elias said. If my schedule changes, hers does. She gets a say in that. Graham was quiet. He looked at Nora in the chair, asleep with her jacket as a blanket. What will you tell her? He said. I'll tell her what Mr. Ashford wants and what it would mean for our days, Elias said. And then I'll ask her what she thinks. And if she says no? She won't, Elias said. But if she did, I'd take it seriously. Graham looked at him for a moment with an expression that Elias recognized from the first night, from the corridor where Graham had come to find him. The expression of a man who has found something he wasn't looking for and is still in the process of understanding what he's found. All right, Graham said. He reached for his water glass and drank from it. Take the time you need. The job is there. They left at 7:45. Elias carried Nora to the truck, which she woke during but only halfway. She got into her booster seat with her eyes mostly closed and buckled herself by feel, which she could do in her sleep and sometimes did. He put her bag on the seat beside her and drove. The road out from Blackridge was dark at this hour, trees on either side and the occasional ranch gate. No other traffic. He drove at an easy pace and listened to Nora breathing in the back seat. Steady, deep. She'd gone back under. He thought about the day. He thought about Marcus Webb standing in front of 42 people and saying what he'd done. He thought about the German collector's handshake. He thought about Vittorio Marchetti on the screen, 91 years old, watching from Maranello, saying that the engine sounded the way it had in 1962. He thought about his grandfather, who had died when Elias was 27 in the spring, in the house by the road with the corrugated roof. Not in the shop, despite what the narrative logic of his life would have suggested, but in a chair by the window, having gone peacefully and without drama, which was very much how he had lived. Elias had driven through the night to get there and arrived 4 hours after it was over. He'd sat in the shop alone for most of the next day, not working, just sitting in the smell of the place, running his hands over the workbench where so much of what he knew had been transferred into him through patience and proximity, and the 10,000 small acts of watching and being watched. He had never been able to properly grieve his grandfather in the way that people said you were supposed to. The grief had gone somewhere, but it had not resolved. It had remained as a kind of presence in the work. Not heavy, not disabling, more like a particular quality of attention that he brought to precision tasks, an awareness that the knowledge in his hands had come from somewhere and from someone, and that this was neither incidental nor easily replaceable. He thought about what Marcus had said. The engine has memory, and the right hand's reminded of what it knows. He thought about Coretti saying that, and his grandfather hearing something similar from Marchetti and Lyon in 1969, and the specific way that a true idea passes through people and takes slightly different shapes in each transmission without losing what makes it true. He was not sentimental about his own place in this. He was clear about it, clear the way you are about facts rather than feelings. He carried something. He was responsible for it. What he did with the responsibility was the question that the past 2 weeks had put more squarely in front of him than anything had in the previous 6 years. He got home at 8:20 and carried Nora inside. She woke up during the transfer from truck to bed, enough to cooperate with the change into pajamas, but not enough to make conversation. She lay down and he pulled the blanket up, and she said, without opening her eyes, "The car sounded good." "It did," he said. "Did the old man like it? The one on the screen?" He stopped. "You heard that?" "I heard some of it," she said. She was quiet for a moment. He was crying. Elias sat on the edge of her bed. He hadn't been close enough to the screen to see that clearly. Was he? "Not a lot," she said. "Just a little. Like when something happens that you thought wasn't going to happen anymore." Elias sat with that for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think that's what it was." She was quiet again. He thought she'd gone to sleep. Then she said, "Are you going to keep working nights?" He looked at her. "Mr. Ashford told me he was going to ask you something," she said. "He asked me if I thought you'd say yes." Elias considered this. "What did you say?" "I said I didn't know." A pause. "I said it depended on what it was." "It's a different job," he said. "At the same place, different hours, better hours, probably. Days instead of nights, mostly. We'd have to rearrange some things." "Like what things?" "Like Mrs. Pelletier's card game nights. I'd be home by then, so you wouldn't need to go to her place." Nora considered this. "That's better," she said. "Her house smells like cats. She has 3 cats. I know. That's a lot." A brief pause. "Would you get to work on the cars, actually work on them?" "Yes," he said. "Like today?" "Like today, and other days, on other cars." She seemed to be processing this with her eyes closed. "That's what you're supposed to do," she said, with the flat certainty of a child who had been observing her father for 5 years and had reached a conclusion. "What do you mean?" he said. "When you talk about the engines," she said, "your voice is different. It's like when I talk about fractions." He looked at her face. The uneven braids on the pillow, the 4 clips still in, the expression of someone who had said something accurate and knew it. "Okay," he said. "I'll think about it." "You already thought about it," she said. "You're just making sure." He sat for another moment. Then he leaned forward and kissed her forehead, and she made the small sound she made when she was registering something without wanting to make a production of it, and he got up and turned off the lamp. At the door he paused. "Nora." "You knew," he said, "about the car, before anyone else." A silence. "I just listened," she said. "Like you said to." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Good," he said. "You're listening." In the days that followed, the aftermath of the event arranged itself into its component parts, and each part found its place. Marcus Webb sent a formal written statement to Graham the Monday after the event, which documented his account of the project, including the specific point at which he'd identified the float bowl orientation issue and the decision he'd made not to raise it. He sent a copy to Elias as well, which Elias received by email. Graham's assistant had asked for his address for this purpose, and read once and then filed without responding to. Marcus did not write to apologize. The statement was not written in the register of apology. It was a factual account, precise, using the same flat accuracy that Marcus had used when he'd spoken to Elias in Bay 14. Elias found this more convincing than an apology would have been. It was the kind of thing that cost a man in Marcus Webb's position something real, not the admission in front of 42 people that had been dramatic and had its own kind of theater, but this quiet, documented, permanent record of the fact of what he'd done. That was the thing you couldn't take back. The financial settlement between Marcus and Graham was handled privately, and Elias didn't know the terms and didn't ask. He knew that some portion of the billing had been returned. He knew this because Graham mentioned it without specifics, in the context of a broader conversation about what the Ferrari project had cost in total and what it could have cost if the problem had been identified on day one. "That's the number I should have spent," Graham said. "What you would have charged if I'd known to ask you." "I wasn't available for hire," Elias said. "You couldn't have asked." "I could have asked who in my building might know something," Graham said. "That was available to me." Elias didn't argue with this. It was true. 2 weeks after the event, Callum came to find Elias. He found him in Bay 9, which was where Elias had been spending his assessment time that particular morning. The Lamborghini was a 1967 400 GT 2+2, dark green, and the issue Elias had spotted from across the room at the event proved on closer examination to be a fuel delivery problem with familial resemblance to what he'd found in the Ferrari. Not identical, different engine architecture entirely, but the same basic story. Components installed with slight incorrectness decades ago, corrected by nobody, because nobody looking at the car had the specific knowledge to find it. He was making notes in a small spiral notebook, not his grandfather's, a new one, though the same brand which he'd found at an office supply store and been disproportionately pleased about, when Callum came in. Callum looked at the car, then at the notebook, then at Elias. "I wanted to say something to you," he said. Elias capped his pen and looked at him. "About the conversation we had," Callum said, "the week before the engine ran. When I came out of the lounge and the thing I said about Nora." "Liability situation," Elias said. Callum winced slightly. "That," he said. "Yes." He stood there for a moment with the particular discomfort of a man working through a prepared statement and finding it doesn't quite fit the reality of saying it out loud to the person it's for. "I was doing the thing I do," he said, "which is managing appearances rather than understanding what's actually in front of me. I'd been watching 14 specialists fail at this car for almost 2 weeks, and I was frustrated, and I took it out sideways on you. And the thing I said about your daughter was—" He stopped. "She's fine," Elias said. "She doesn't know what you said." "I know she's fine. I know she doesn't know." Callum looked at the car. "I'm saying I was wrong. Not about the liability thing. Technically, there probably is a real liability consideration, but in how I said it and why I said it when I said it. I was trying to control something I didn't understand, and I took it out on the person it was easiest to take it out on." Elias looked at him. "The easiest person," he said. "Yes," Callum said, which was, "because of what I was," Elias said, "not who I was." Callum was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "because of the job title, because of how I'd categorized you." He said it without dressing it up. "I didn't ask who you were. I saw the uniform and I made assumptions and I operated on them for 2 years. He paused. "Graham told me that's the same mistake he made, and he's right, but his version didn't come with the edge mine did. I was actively dismissive of you more than once." "More than the once I heard about," Elias said. Callum looked at him directly. "Yes." Elias considered him. He thought about what to say, and he thought about how the easy version of this moment would go. The gracious acceptance of the apology, the mutual acknowledgement, the reset. He thought about whether that was the right version. "The night the engine ran," he said. "Graham spoke to you privately." "Yes." "What did he say?" Callum said, "He said that my job going forward was to support the people in this building who knew things I didn't, rather than to manage them. He said the organization was going to change and that my role in it was going to change, and that he valued what I was actually good at, but that what I was actually good at was a narrower thing than I'd been allowed to believe. And you accepted that." "I accepted it because it was true," Callum said. I've been in this building for 3 years telling myself I understood what was in here. I didn't understand anything. I understood scheduling and vendor management and the names of cars. He paused. I got very good at the names. There was something honest in this that Elias responded to, not warmly exactly, but with a recognition that honesty was being offered and deserved acknowledgement. I appreciate you saying it, Elias said. Callum nodded. He looked like he might have more to say and then decided he didn't, which was the correct decision. He turned to leave and then stopped. The Lamborghini, he said, nodding at the 400 GT. How bad is it? Not bad, Elias said. Probably 2 days of work. A week, if there are secondary issues I haven't found yet. What kind of secondary issues? I won't know until I get further in, Elias said. That's how it works. Callum nodded. He seemed to want to say something else about the car. Some deployment of the terminology he'd spent 3 years acquiring. And then he didn't, which was also the correct decision. He left. Elias reopened his notebook and found his place. Tuan. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the event, Petra Stanholt called from Vancouver. Elias was in the kitchen when his phone rang, making dinner. Rice on the stove, fish in the oven, Nora at the table doing something with her homework that involved more erasing than writing. He looked at the number, didn't recognize it, almost didn't answer, and then did. It's Petra Stanholt, she said, from Blackridge. I know who you are, he said. He turned the rice down and moved to the hallway where it was quieter. How are you? Working, she said. I have a project in Vancouver, another in London in January, and I've been writing something. A brief pause. I'm writing a piece on the Coretti-Vidal methodology for a technical journal, the kind of thing that maybe 400 people in the world will read, but those 400 people should have it, Elias said. Yes. Exactly. He could hear that she was pleased he'd understood that without needing the explanation. I have documentation I've assembled. It's Vidal's published work from the 70s, which is limited but exists. Coretti's work is harder because he never published anything. I have some second-hand accounts, the Milan article, 2 recorded interviews he gave late in his career. She stopped. I want to include the altitude correction for the needle jet specification, the figure your grandfather derived. That's not Coretti's work, Elias said. That's my grandfather's. I know. I want to credit him. Elias was quiet for a moment. His name was Armand Moreau, he said. He worked in the Loire Valley. He wasn't known in the professional world, not in the way Vidal and Coretti were known. He was a local craftsman who happened to figure something out that nobody else did. That's precisely why it should be documented, Petra said. Elias looked at the wall of the hallway. Above the light switch there was a small drawing Nora had made when she was 3. A house and a figure beside it that was supposed to be him, stick-limbed and disproportionate, with enormous hands that she'd colored carefully in brown crayon. She'd made the hands large on purpose. She'd been very clear about this. I have his notebook, Elias said. I know, she said. You mentioned it. It has other material in it, not just the altitude correction. Notes on timing adjustments, fuel pressure calculations for specific engines, observations about material behavior in different temperature conditions. He paused. Things that probably aren't in any document anywhere else. The silence on her end had the quality of someone keeping themselves from saying too much too quickly. I'd like to see it, she said in a controlled voice. I'll make you a copy, he said. The original stays with me. Of course, she said. Absolutely. Send me your address in Vancouver. I'll scan it and send you a digital copy. I'll also need to ask you questions, she said, about context, about which entries relate to which engines, what time period, what the particular problem was that he was solving. Some of it won't make sense without that. I know, he said. Call me when you have questions. Another pause. Then she said, I want to credit you as well, for the Ferrari restoration. In the article. Not just your grandfather's figure, your specific identification of the compound problem and the technique you used to correct it. Elias was quiet. You don't want that, she said, reading the silence correctly. It's not that I don't want it, he said. It's that There's no good reason to attach my name to a technical journal that 400 people read. My grandfather's name, yes. That serves the documentation. Mine doesn't serve anything. It serves the historical record, she said. Your grandfather's lineage doesn't end with him. If I write that the Coretti-Vidal approach is a dead tradition, that's inaccurate. Your evidence of its continuation. Your work at Blackridge is evidence of its continuation. Elias stood in the hallway and thought about this for a while. Write the article, he said. Include my grandfather's figure. Tell me what questions you have. He paused. And if there's a place in the article where my name serves the purpose, put it there. But don't put it somewhere it doesn't belong. That's how journalism works, she said. Good, he said. Then we understand each other. She laughed, which was the first time he'd heard her laugh, and it was an uncomplicated sound, the kind that meant she was genuinely pleased. I'll send questions next week, she said. I'll be here, he said. He hung up and went back to the kitchen. The rice was done. He took it off the burner and checked the fish. Who was that? Nora said from the table, without looking up from her erasing. A woman named Petra, he said. She's writing something. About engines. About our engines? About the kind of engines we work on, yes. He opened the oven. Sit up straight. She straightened her back by approximately 10 degrees, which was the amount of straightening she was willing to provide in response to that request, and continued erasing. He said yes to Graham on a Tuesday morning in the mezzanine office over coffee. He said yes with two conditions, that his schedule would allow him to leave by 3:15 on days Nora had school, and that the title not be something that made him sound like an administrator. Graham said yes to both without negotiating, which Elias had not expected and which landed differently than he'd anticipated, not as a victory, but as something simpler and harder to name, something like being taken at face value. They shook hands. The handshake was brief and slightly awkward, in the way of two men who are not natural handshakers, but understand the gesture as marking something. Graham said, I want to do something about the shop. Elias looked at him. Your grandfather's shop, Graham said. What you described. The building in the Loire Valley. You mentioned it was still standing. As far as I know, Elias said. My aunt owns the property. She's never sold it. I think she's rented it once or twice, agricultural storage or something. I want to talk to you about whether there's something worth preserving there, Graham said. Not necessarily bring it here, just the tools, the documentation, anything that exists from that period, if it's there. Elias thought about this. He had not been to that building since his grandfather's death, 17 years ago. He had driven past it once, 5 years later, on a trip through the region for a job, and had slowed the car, but not stopped. The corrugated roof had still been there. My aunt would have to agree, he said. Of course. She might, he said. She's been trying to figure out what to do with the property for years. She doesn't want to sell it, but she doesn't know what to do with it. He paused. She liked my grandfather. She was his youngest sister, 20 years younger. She visited the shop when she was a child. Tell her what you're thinking, Graham said. There's no deadline. Elias nodded. He thought about the notebook in the closet at home, now moved from under the winter coat to the top shelf, which he'd done 3 days after the event, a small rearrangement that had taken 30 seconds and meant something he hadn't examined too closely. There's also, he said, the question of what happens to what I know. Graham waited. I'm 44, Elias said. Coretti was the last person I transmitted this to. Transmitted from, I mean. I've had 2 assistants in my career briefly. I didn't teach them properly. I was too busy or too distracted or not ready to be the person doing the passing. He paused. If this is going to be what I do here, if I'm responsible for this collection's mechanical integrity, then at some point the question of who comes after me becomes real. You want to take an apprentice? Graham said. I want to think about taking an apprentice, Elias said. The right person. Not someone with the right resume. Someone with the right... He stopped. Disposition, Graham said. Yes. How would you find that person? I'd look for someone who listens, Elias said, and asks bad questions, and doesn't pretend to know things they don't. Graham looked at him. That's the whole criteria? The rest follows from that, Elias said. The technique can be taught. The disposition can't. You can only recognize it. Graham nodded. He seemed to be turning this over, fitting it into a larger picture he was building of what the facility could become. We'll talk about what that looks like, he said. When you're ready. When I'm ready, Elias said. He finished his coffee and set the mug down. Below them, through the mezzanine window, the vault floor was lit in its soft morning light. 47 cars, the Ferrari in Bay 14, the Lamborghini in Bay 9, where his notes were sitting in the spiral notebook beside the workbench. He looked at the room below the way you look at a place you're beginning to understand belongs to you in some way that isn't about ownership. He thought about his first night in this building 2 years ago, the orientation, the equipment rundown, Callum walking him through the maintenance schedule with the efficient patience of a man explaining things to someone he's already categorized. He thought about the first time he'd walked the vault floor alone, late on his second night after his shift was mostly done. The particular quality of that walk, the 47 cars and the quiet, the way certain of them had stopped him without him consciously deciding to stop. He thought about the Ferrari. He thought about the sound it made when it started, the voice of it filling the room, the specific texture of what that felt like standing next to it with 2 fingers on the engine housing, feeling the vibration come up through his hands. He looked at his hands now, in his lap in the mezzanine chair. They looked the same as they always did. He stood up. I should start on the Lamborghini, he said. Of course, Graham said. Elias went down the mezzanine stairs, crossed the vault floor, and went into Bay 9. Nora came with him the following Thursday. Not as a tag-along, not because there was nowhere else for her to go. Mrs. Pelletier's card game was still on Thursdays, but Elias was now working days and the schedule no longer required it. She came because she asked to, and he had said yes. She sat on the stool he put beside the workbench and watched him work on the Lamborghini. She didn't ask many questions, which was partly because she understood that questions at the wrong moment disrupted the work, something she'd learned from watching him over years of Thursdays, and partly because she was content to watch. She had a book in her bag, but she didn't take it out. At one point, mid-morning, he handed her a component, one of the fuel injector housings he'd removed for cleaning, a small and beautifully machined thing, heavy for its size, warm from sitting in his hands. Feel that, he said. She took it in both hands and turned it over. She ran her thumb along the machined face and across the fitting port. She held it up and looked through the passage. It's precise, she said. That's what it's supposed to be, he said. But feel it, past the precision. What else? She turned it over again. She pressed her thumb harder against the face. Old, she said, like it remembers. He looked at her. Good, he said. He held his hand out and she gave it back. That's exactly right. She went back to watching. At noon he stopped for lunch and they ate sandwiches at the workbench because neither of them wanted to leave the bay, and Nora talked about school with the specific energy she reserved for things she was currently frustrated with. The fractions unit had moved on to something she didn't find as intuitive, and her frustration with this was detailed and genuine. What's the part that isn't working? Elias said. The division part. I don't see why dividing by a fraction makes it bigger. He thought about this for a moment. Then he picked up one of the fuel injector housings from the clean side of the workbench and set it in front of her. If I have this housing, he said, and I want to know how many pieces that are half its size fit into it, then I divide by half, she said. Right. And how many fit? She looked at the housing. 2, she said. So dividing by 1/2 gives you 2, he said, which is bigger than 1. She stared at the housing. Oh, she said. The more times something fits into something else, he said, the more of them there are. That makes sense, she said. A pause. Why didn't Miss Rodriguez say it like that? She probably did, he said. You just needed to hear it differently. Nora picked up the housing and looked at it. Can I keep this? She said. No, he said. It goes back in the car. She set it down, slightly disappointed but not surprised. Okay, she said. She picked up the second half of her sandwich. They sat in Bay 9 and ate, the Lamborghini beside them, the vault quiet around them, the light coming through the high windows at the angle it came through at noon in October. This was a Thursday. Some Thursdays were ordinary, and some had something else in them, a quality of rightness that you could feel without being able to describe it to anyone else. Elias sat next to his daughter at the workbench with the fuel injector components laid out in order on the clean cloth and felt it. Not happiness exactly, not contentment exactly, something that included both of those but was also something else, something that had to do with being in the correct place, doing the correct work with the correct people present. He looked at Nora. She was looking at the Lamborghini with the specific, focused attention she brought to things that were thinking about her back. "Dad?" she said. "Yeah." "When can I learn?" He looked at her. She was 5. She was asking as a genuine question, not a dramatic request, just wanting to know the timeline. "You're already learning," he said. "You've been learning for years." "But when can I touch the engines?" He thought about it. He thought about his grandfather's answer to the same question. Not the same question, but the equivalent 12-year-old Elias standing in the shop wanting his hands on something. His grandfather had made him wait 6 months from when the serious learning began. He'd watched for 6 months, and then his grandfather had handed him a component and said, "Tell me what your fingers are finding." "When your hands know what they're looking for," he said. She thought about this. "How will I know when they know?" "You'll ask a question," he said, "and the answer will already be in your fingers before the question is finished." She looked at her own hands. "Okay," she said, as if this was a satisfactory timeline. He went back to the Lamborghini and she went back to watching, and the vault held them both in its climate-controlled 47-car silence. And outside, the November light moved across the parking lot and the hills beyond, going the way light always went in the afternoon, slowly westward, with the patient and indifferent precision of something that had been doing this exact thing for longer than anyone alive could account for. November came into the valley like it always did, without announcement, without the theatrical color of the hills further east, just a gradual cooling and a shift in the quality of the light, the sky going from the clear, hard blue of October to something softer and more tentative, as if the season was still deciding how serious it intended to be. Elias noticed it on his drive-in every morning. The hills above the private road had gone from gold to a muted brown, and the oak trees along the property boundary had finally let go of enough leaves that you could see the sky through them in ways you couldn't in summer. He drove the same road he'd been driving for 2 years, but it looked different from the truck now. Different in the way a room looks different once you understand what it's for. He'd spent 2 years looking at this road as the path to a job. He was still working that out, the new version of it, but the working out felt different from the confusion that had preceded it. He was in earlier than he used to be. 6:45 some mornings. The vault was his before anyone else arrived, before the administrative staff, before the part-time specialist Graham had begun bringing in for specific projects, before Callum, who kept 9 o'clock hours with the reliability of a man whose internal schedule had been set early in life and wasn't going to change. Elias had come to value the first hour. He walked the floor the way Graham walked it, slowly, looking at things without agenda, letting the 47 cars tell him what they were that morning. Some mornings this produced nothing. Other mornings he noticed something. A detail in the light on a fender that indicated a repair older than the record suggested. A sound from the climate system that he'd flagged to the maintenance contractor. A smell in Bay 23 that turned out to be a minor oil seep from the 1953 Maserati that hadn't been on any maintenance record because nobody had been close enough or patient enough to find it. He was building a picture. That was how he thought of it. Not a project, not a program, but a picture. The gradual accumulation of knowledge about what was actually in this building versus what the documentation said was in it. The documentation was incomplete. Most documentation was. Real knowledge of a collection like this lived in people who'd worked closely with it, and most of those people had moved on or weren't here anymore. And so the picture had to be rebuilt from the ground up, observation by observation, morning by morning. He kept his notes in the new spiral notebook, which was now half full. He kept his grandfather's notebook on the workbench in Bay 9, in a flat archival box that Petra had sent from Vancouver, because she'd said the original paper needed to breathe and the box would slow down the acidification. He'd thought this was slightly excessive and then had looked at the notebook, the pencil notes in his grandfather's cramped, precise hand, the The margins annotated with later additions in a different pencil, softer lead, the years when his grandfather's hands had begun to shake, and had put it in the box without further argument. Petra's article came out in December. It was published in an automotive historical journal out of London. The kind of publication that arrived in a plain envelope, printed on good paper, with no advertising and a subscription list that probably numbered in the hundreds. She'd sent Elias a digital copy before publication, and a physical copy when it appeared. He read it twice. The article was titled, "In the Dry Manner of Technical Journals, Empirical Methodology in Post-War Italian Racing Engine Restoration, the Vidal Carretti Lineage and Its Continuation." It ran to 22 pages. The first half covered Leon Vidal's work, his documented techniques, his published letters, the two interviews that existed, and the middle section addressed Bruno Carretti, drawing on the Milan obituary and the recorded interviews and the testimony of several people who had worked with him or observed his work. The final third dealt with the altitude correction figure, attributed to Armand Moreau, explained in technical detail, with the empirical method of its derivation described as precisely as the notebook allowed. And then, at the end of that section, a paragraph that Elias read 3 times. The methodology described here did not end with Carretti's death in 2014. The restoration of a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO at the Black Ridge Motor Vault in Northern California in October of this year demonstrated the technique in its most complete practical application. The individual responsible for that restoration, Elias Moreau, grandson of Armand Moreau and former student of both Vidal and Carretti, employed the altitude-corrected needle jet specification derived by his grandfather alongside diagnostic methods identifiable as consistent with the Vidal-Carretti approach. The engine, which had resisted restoration by a team of 14 specialists over 12 days, was corrected and running within a single working day. This is not offered as anecdote. It is offered as evidence that the lineage continues, that the knowledge is not lost, and that the account given here is a description of a living tradition rather than a historical epitaph. He set the article down. He sat at the workbench in Bay 9 for a while, not doing anything. The Lamborghini was behind him, fully reassembled, running correctly now. The fuel delivery issue resolved and documented in the spiral notebook with the date and the specific corrective actions and the measurements taken before and after. The 400 GT had turned out to have 2 secondary issues beyond the one he'd identified, both minor, both addressable. He'd addressed them. The car ran the way it was supposed to run, which was not smoothly. It was a 1967 Lamborghini with 57 years of character in the engine, but correctly, purposefully. He thought about his grandfather. He tried to imagine Armand Moreau reading a sentence that called his empirical figure a piece of a living tradition rather than a historical artifact. And he couldn't quite construct the image because his grandfather had been a man who would have found the entire premise of such an article slightly absurd. Why write about it when you could just do it, was more or less his position on documentation. But under the absurdity, Elias thought, he would have been pleased. Not about the recognition, about the fact that the figure was correct, that it still worked 60 years later, that the thing he'd worked out on a notepad in his own garage was still making engines run right. That was the part he'd care about. Elias called his aunt that evening. He hadn't spoken to her in 8 months. She was 72 now, living in Tours, still in the house she'd shared with her husband before he died 4 years ago. She answered on the 3rd ring and sounded pleased to hear from him, and they talked for a while about ordinary things. Nora, how the year had gone, the winter in the Loire Valley. And then Elias told her about the job at Black Ridge and what Graham had said about the shop. His aunt was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather's shop," she said. "Yes." "I drove past it in September," she said. "Someone is renting the field adjacent for hay. The building itself, nobody's been in it for at least 3 years. Is it still standing?" "When I drove past it was," she said. "The roof looked all right. I didn't go in." "What would it take to let me go in?" he said. A pause. "It's your grandfather's shop, Elias. It's your family's. You don't need my permission." "I'd need the key," he said. "And I'd need to know you were all right with what might happen to some of what's in there." "The tools," she said. If there are tools left, if there's anything left. She was quiet again. He could hear the particular quality of her kitchen, the faint radio she kept on in the background, the sounds of a house that was lived in alone. Your grandfather always said the worst thing that could happen to the shop was for it to sit empty, she said. He said a shop that isn't working is a kind of death. He said that. Many times. When your father stopped working there, he said it. A pause. If there's something there that should be used, then it should be used. I'll fly over in the spring, Elias said, with Nora, if she can miss a few days of school. I'd like her to see it. His aunt made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Warm, brief, the sound of someone whose history with the place is complicated, and who has made their peace with the complication. She looks like your father, you know, she said, from the photographs you send. She looks like herself, he said. Yes, his aunt said. They always do. Bring her in the spring, said. Marcus Webb sent a card at Christmas, a physical card, handwritten, which Elias had not expected. The card was from London, on good paper, brief. It said, I've been telling people about the work you did, not because it helps you. I suspect it doesn't. You seem to operate outside those channels, but because it should be said. I understand better now what I was standing in front of. I'm sorry it took what it took for me to understand it. And then his name. No flourish, no postscript. Elias read it once and put it in the archival box with his grandfather's notebook, which was perhaps the best address he had for things that deserved to be kept. He did not write back because he didn't know what to write back that was as honest as the card. And he'd learned from his grandfather that it was better to say nothing than to say less than what you meant. January was when Nora started asking real questions. Not the questions she'd been asking since she could talk. The observational questions, the what is that and why does it do that questions that were really just curiosity out loud. These were different. These were the questions of someone who had been watching a specific thing for a long time and had started to develop a theory about it and was beginning to test the theory. She came in on Thursdays, as she always had. She sat on the stool by the workbench. She watched, and then she started asking things that required him to think before answering. Why do the older engines run differently than the newer ones, even when everything's working right? How do you know where to put your hand before you know what you're looking for? When you listen to the engine, what exactly are you listening for? Like, what does wrong sound like compared to right? He answered them the way his grandfather had answered him. Not all at once, not with lectures, but precisely and as completely as the question deserved, and then he stopped and let her sit with the answer. After the third Thursday of questions like this, he gave her a component to hold. Not the fuel injector housing this time, something smaller. A needle jet from the parts cabinet, a retired one, not going back into any engine, just a piece of metal that had been inside a carburetor for decades and had the particular quality of such objects, dense and warm and precise. Tell me what your fingers are finding, he said. She took it in both hands and turned it over. She ran her thumb along the needle bore and across the metering face. She held it up and looked at the jet hole at the tip. She turned it again. She was quiet for almost a full minute. It's smaller than it looks, she said, and the precision doesn't go all the way through. It goes as far as it has to, and then it stops. He looked at her. Show me where it stops, he said. She pressed her thumb to a specific point on the component, the transition between the machine needle bore and the cast body. The exact point where the tolerance requirement changed because the function changed. Here, she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Good. That's right. That's exactly right. She handed it back. She wasn't showing off, wasn't looking for praise. She was just reporting what she'd found, the way you report the reading from an instrument. He took the component back and stood there for a moment with it in his hand, feeling what she'd described without her knowing she was describing it. The transition from precision to ordinary casting that lived at that exact point. He put it back in the cabinet. He thought about his grandfather in the shop in the Loire Valley, a Thursday in early spring. Rain on the corrugated roof, 12-year-old Elias holding a carburetor float for the first time and trying to report what his fingers found. He thought about his grandfather's face, patient, attentive, not performing patience, but simply being it, the way a person is when they've done something long enough that its demands have become their nature. He thought, this is how it goes. Not the teaching of it, not the formal transmission, but the actual movement of it, person to person, the thing passing through the living to the not yet knowing, his grandfather to him to Nora. Whatever she would do with it, whatever direction her life took, the information was in her hands now. The hands knew something. The rest would follow or it wouldn't, but the knowing was there, and it would stay. In February, the conversation about an apprentice became real. It had been theoretical until then, something Elias had raised with Graham in the fall, a possibility discussed in the abstract. Then Graham mentioned that a young woman had reached out to the facility through Petra's article. Her name was Simone Adeyemi. She was 24. She'd been working at a restoration shop in Oakland for 2 years after a degree in mechanical engineering, and she'd read the article in the library at her old university and had written a careful, specific letter asking whether there was any possibility of working alongside the person described in it. Graham showed Elias the letter. He read it twice. It was 3 paragraphs, handwritten, no errors, no overstatement. She described what she was currently doing and what she understood her gaps to be. Not the gaps in her resume, the gaps in her knowledge, which were 2 different things. She said she understood that engine work at this level was learned by proximity and time and not by coursework or credential. And she said that if there was any way to be in proximity to work like this, she would accept whatever terms made that possible. What do you think? Graham said. She understands the shape of what she doesn't know, Elias said. That's not common. Do you want to meet her? He thought about it for a moment. Ask her to come for a day, he said. Not an interview, a work day. I'll give her something to do and see how she does it. Graham wrote back to her. She came on a Thursday in late February, which meant Nora was there, which Elias had considered and decided was all right. Simone arrived at 7:15, which was early enough to matter, and she arrived in clothes appropriate for shop work, which also mattered. She shook Graham's hand in the reception area and Elias's in the vault, and her handshake was direct and her eyes held his without performance. He took her to Bay 14. This is what you read about, he said. The Ferrari. She stood in front of it with her hands at her sides and looked at it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, Can I look at the engine? That's what we're here for, he said. She lifted the hood. She stood over the engine bay and looked at it for a long time without touching anything. Ask me what you're seeing, he said. I'm not seeing anything yet, she said. I'm looking. He said nothing. He stepped back. She looked for 2 full minutes. Then she said without turning, The center carburetor looks different from the outer 2, small but different. Did something happen to it? Yes, he said. What? Work it out, he said. She was quiet for a moment. She leaned in closer. It's been removed and reinstalled more recently than the others, she said. The screws on the top are slightly different in how the finish is worn, and the fuel line connection on the left side has a different kind of marking, like it was worked on. And? He said. Another pause. The orientation mark on the bowl, she said. She was nearly whispering now, not performing quietness, but genuinely concentrating. It lines up different from what I'd expect. Did it have an orientation problem? He looked at her. Yes, he said. She straightened up and looked at him. That's what the article was about, she said. That's what was wrong. That's part of what was wrong, he said. She nodded. She looked back at the engine. The needle jets, she said. The altitude specification. You remember the details. I read the article 4 times, she said. He studied her. You said in your letter that you understood your gaps, he said. What are they? She looked at him directly. I understand mechanical systems at the engineering level. I understand how they should work in theory. What I don't understand is how to listen to them. She paused. My supervisor at the Oakland shop told me once that I was very precise and not very intuitive, and that the intuitive part was what made the difference between competent and exceptional. He said he didn't know how to teach it. Another pause. I think you do. What makes you think that? Because you learned it from someone, she said. Which means it can be learned. He stood there for a moment. It takes time, he said. Longer than you want it to. I know that, You'll spend the first several months doing things that don't seem connected to what you're trying to learn. I understand. And I won't tell you everything, he said. I'll show you things, and you'll have to find what I'm showing you yourself. If you miss it, I won't always go back. She said without flinching, my last supervisor was the same way. I missed things. I figured out how not to. Nora appeared from the other side of the car. She'd been there the whole time, sitting on the low step of the nearest display barrier, watching. Simone looked at her with a brief, unguarded surprise. This is Nora, Elias said. Hi, Nora said. She looked at Simone with the assessment she gave everything. Did you get it right? The engine, Simone said. I got most of it. Dad says most of it is different from right, Nora said. Simone looked at Elias. She's not wrong, Elias said. I know, Simone said. She looked back at Nora. I got most of it right and one part wrong. The altitude specification on the needle jets. I knew what it was from reading, but I didn't know why. And I should have said I didn't know why instead of saying I knew it. Nora considered this. That's fair, she decided, with the judiciousness of someone whose father had been making this exact distinction for her entire conscious life. He told Graham that evening to offer Simone the position. She started in March. The first week, Elias gave her nothing to do with the engines. He gave her the documentation files, all of them, the incomplete and conflicting and occasionally baffling records of the collection's maintenance history, and told her to tell him what she found. She spent 3 days on it and came back with 11 specific observations, 2 of which were things he'd already found, and 9 of which were new. 2 of those 9 significant enough to change the order of his assessment work. He didn't tell her she'd done well. He incorporated what she'd found into the notebook and moved on. She seemed to understand that incorporation was the acknowledgement. The second week he had her at the workbench while he worked on the 1959 Aston Martin in Bay 26. He worked, and she watched. She was allowed to ask 1 question per session, which he'd established as a rule on the first day, and which had been met with a brief, controlled expression of frustration and then acceptance. The single question rule was his grandfather's rule. It forced precision in the questioning, which forced precision in the looking that preceded the question, which was the actual point. Her first question, on day 2. Why do you touch the connection before and after checking it visually rather than just visually? His answer, the eye can be tricked by similarity, the hands can't. Tactile confirmation isn't redundant. It's a different information source. She wrote it down. He didn't tell her to. She just did. By the end of March, Nora had evaluated Simone on the only scale available to her, which was whether the person paid real attention to what they were doing or performed attention, and had concluded that Simone paid real attention. She communicated this conclusion to Elias not through statement, but through the quality of how she interacted with Simone on Thursdays. Direct, easy, the way she was with people she'd decided were worth being direct with. Simone, for her part, treated Nora with the particular respect of someone who has correctly identified that the child is not a peripheral element of the situation, but a central one, and who has adjusted her understanding of the situation accordingly. In April, Elias flew to France. He took Nora out of school for 4 days, which required a letter to the principal and a plan for her to make up what she missed, both of which she handled with an efficiency that he found both practical and slightly funny. She packed her own bag, which included the 4 gear clips, the picture book she was currently on, her small flashlight, and a notebook she'd bought at the drugstore, which she said was for writing down what she found in France. He didn't ask what she expected to find. He figured she'd tell him when she found it. His aunt met them in Tours. She was small and precise, with his grandfather's eyes and his grandmother's manner, and she held Nora at arm's length for a moment before embracing her with the warmth of someone who has been waiting to do exactly this. They drove out to the shop in his aunt's car on a spring morning with the Loire Valley in the particular green of early April, the sky cloudless and the air cold enough to see your breath if you stood still. The shop was at the end of a lane behind a low stone wall, set back from the road by a short drive of packed gravel. The corrugated roof was still there. There were rust streaks on the south side where a downspout had failed, and the wooden door was warped in its frame, But the building was standing and the walls were intact and the glass in the high-side windows was unbroken. His aunt had the key. She gave it to Elias and stepped back, which was the right thing to do, and he stood in front of the door for a moment. Nora stood beside him. "Is this where your grandfather worked?" she said. "Yes." "What's inside?" "I don't know," he said. "I haven't been in for 17 years. She looked at the door. "Are you nervous?" He thought about it honestly. "A little," he said. "Me too," she said. "Let's go." He put the key in the lock. The lock was stiff from disuse, but it turned with pressure, and the door swung inward with the sound of a space that hadn't been opened in years. A small rush of cool air, the smell of old oil and dry wood, and the specific mineral smell of metal that has been still for a long time in a cold climate. He stepped inside. The shop was exactly the right size. He'd forgotten this, or not forgotten, but not been able to hold the specific scale of it in his memory correctly. It was smaller than he'd been carrying it, and the smallness of it was not disappointing but clarifying, the way places from childhood are when you return to them and discover the scale was always real, only your relationship to it has changed. The workbench ran along the left wall, long and deep, with the remains of a pegboard tool arrangement above it. Most of the hooks empty, a few still holding small tools that had been left, apparently judged not worth taking when the shop was last cleared. The floor was concrete, stained in the particular patterns of a shop floor, oil marks and the impression of years of movement in specific paths. 2 rolling cabinets stood against the right wall and a parts rack behind them. A single overhead light fixture, no bulb. He stood in the middle of it and just breathed. Nora walked in beside him and turned slowly, looking at everything. She went to the workbench and stood in front of it and ran her hands along the surface the way she'd run her hands along the tool cart at Blackridge on her first real Thursday, feeling for what the object was. "It's the same as yours," she said. "The bench. Same kind." He looked at the bench. He hadn't consciously noticed this. "He gave me my bench," he said, "when I set up my first shop. He had an extra." She nodded, as if this explained everything. He crossed to the rolling cabinets. He opened the first one. Inside, tools, organized with the system he recognized from 30 years of proximity to it. His grandfather's system was specific and idiosyncratic and had been explained to Elias once, briefly, with the implication that anyone who required a second explanation had not been paying sufficient attention. The tools were still there, most of them. Someone had taken some, probably when the shop was last cleared, or perhaps his grandfather himself in his final years when the arthritis had made some tools pointless to keep. But many were there. The precision measuring instruments in their own section, the carburetor tools organized by engine family, the ignition tools with the specific sequence that matched his grandfather's preferred inspection order. He opened the second cabinet. Notebooks. 15 of them, maybe more, stacked in 2 columns with the organized care of someone who understood that the notebooks were the most important things in the shop. They were the same brand as the one that now lived in the archival box at Blackridge, the same plain gray covers, the same format, decades of them filling the cabinet. He stood in front of the cabinet for a long time. Nora came and stood beside him and looked at the notebooks. "Are those like Grandpa's?" she said. Not his grandfather's, so she'd always called the notebook that, the way she referred to it, Grandpa's notebook, as if Armand Moreau were a relative she'd simply missed meeting rather than a man who'd died before her parents were together. "They're from him," Elias said. "He kept notebooks. Many of them." She looked at them. Then she looked at him. "Are you going to read them?" He reached in and took the top one from the left column. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was his grandfather's. The cramped, precise pencil, the annotations in the margins. The date at the top of the first page, 1961. This notebook was from before he was born, before his father was doing serious work in the shop, from the early years when the knowledge was being built entry by entry in this room on this bench under whatever light was available. He stood there for a long time. He thought about Petra's article and the phrase she'd used, a living tradition. He thought about the 14 notebooks he hadn't known existed, stacked in a cabinet in a shop he hadn't entered for 17 years. He thought about all the figures in here, all the specifications and corrections and empirical derivations that hadn't made it into the one notebook his grandfather had given him, that had lived here instead, in these gray notebooks, waiting to be found. He thought, the technique doesn't die. It only waits. He took out his phone and called Petra. She answered on the second ring. I'm in my grandfather's shop in France, he said. A pause. And? There are 15 notebooks I didn't know about. The sound on her end was not a word. It was the sound of someone absorbing a significant piece of information. I'm going to need help documenting them properly, he said. The historical context, the technical context. Some of this will need verification against other sources. I'll come, she said. It might be a lot of material. Elias, she said, I'll come. He looked at the notebooks. He looked at the shop around him, the bench and the stained floor and the empty pegboard hooks and the tools still in their correct places in the cabinets, waiting. He looked at Nora, who had gone to the workbench and climbed up onto the stool beside it. The stool that had been there for decades, that he had sat on as a 12-year-old, that before him had probably held his father, and before that had simply been a stool in the shop waiting for whoever needed it. She'd pulled out her notebook, the drugstore one, with the purple cover, and uncapped a pen. What are you doing? He said. Writing down what I find, she said. I'm finding that it smells like your workshop, but older, and that the bench is the same, and that there are a lot of books. Notebooks, he said. Not books. What's the difference? A book is finished, he said. A notebook is still working. She wrote this down with the seriousness she brought to things she intended to remember. He stood in the middle of his grandfather's shop with a 1961 notebook in his hands, and the April light coming through the high side windows at the angle that April light found in the Loire Valley, cool and clear and without agenda. And he felt something that took him a moment to identify, because it had been a long time since he'd felt exactly this form of it. Not happiness, not relief, not the specific satisfaction of the engine running or the work done correctly, but something underneath all of those, a foundation feeling, the feeling of being in the place where the thing came from. He was in the place where it came from, and it was still here. They flew home on a Saturday. Nora slept through most of the flight, which she could do anywhere, and Elias sat beside her with his grandfather's first notebook on the tray table, reading. He read slowly, the way the material required, stopping often to work out what a particular entry was addressing or to follow the logic of a calculation that spanned 3 pages. The handwriting was harder to read in the early notebooks. His grandfather had been younger, still developing the compressed precision that the later notebooks showed, but it was legible if you were patient. He read the entry from September 1962, which was the summer before the Ferrari 250 GTO had been raced at Monza by the factory team, and which described a visit to a small private collection near Tours, where a 250 GT, an earlier model, not the GTO, had been brought to his grandfather for diagnostic work. The car would not start consistently. His grandfather had spent 2 days on it. The entry described the problem, the approach, the dead ends, and then the needle jet. I think I have found it. The specification in the documentation does not account for conditions here. I will try a different setting tomorrow and record what happens. The next entry, 1 day later. It runs. I was right. Wrote down the figure. That was all. 2 sentences. His grandfather had corrected a problem in 1962 that Elias had used to correct a different car 62 years later, and between those 2 events there had been a life, and then another life, and then a third, and the knowledge had moved through all of them the way knowledge moves when the people carrying it take it seriously enough to write it down and hand it on. He closed the notebook. Outside the airplane window, the Atlantic was 35,000 feet below, dark and indifferent and enormous. Nora shifted in her sleep and her head came to rest against his arm. He didn't move. He thought about the shop, which his aunt had agreed to restore. Not to recreate, not to preserve as a monument, but to make usable again, to bring back to the condition a working shop required. He'd called a contractor in Tours before they left, using a number his aunt had given him. The corrugated roof needed sections replaced. The electrical was old. The heating system was gone, would need to be rebuilt. It would take several months and a realistic budget that Graham had agreed to without the hesitation Elias had expected. You said the worst thing that happens to a shop is sitting empty, Graham had said, when Elias told him about the notebooks. My grandfather said it, Elias said. Then we don't let it sit empty. He thought about next year. The spring, maybe, when the restoration was done and the shop was usable. He thought about bringing Simone there, because there were things in those 15 notebooks that she should encounter in the context of where they were written, and because proximity to the place where knowledge originated was its own form of teaching. He thought about Nora in the shop, on the stool, writing in her purple notebook. The bench is the same, and not books, notebooks, still working. He thought about Vittorio Marchetti on the screen in Maranello, 91 years old, watching the engine run. He thought about all the ways a thing persists when the people responsible for it decide it matters. The year turned. Black Ridge in January was the same quiet building it had always been, the same 47 cars in their bays, the same climate-controlled 58 degrees and 42% humidity, the same soft overhead light. But it was not the same vault. The assessment was 2/3 complete and had turned up 9 cars that needed specific attention, 3 of them urgent. Simone was working on the second of the urgent ones, a 1955 Mercedes 300 SL with a fuel injection issue that she had correctly diagnosed and was working to correct, methodically, in the manner she'd been developing since March. She still asked her one question per session. The questions were getting harder, which meant she was seeing more, which was the point. Elias checked her work each day, not because he didn't trust her, but because this was what the relationship required. He checked it the way his grandfather had checked his, without comment when it was right, with a single precise observation when it wasn't. The ratio of right to not right was improving. She didn't need to be told it was improving. She could feel it in the work. On a Thursday, in late January, near the end of the afternoon, Nora sat on the stool beside the workbench in Bay 9 while Elias cleaned the day's tools. She had her homework spread on the far end of the bench, fourth quarter fractions review, which she had declared boring, having fully mastered fractions in all their forms after the conversation about the fuel injector housing. Simone came in from the Mercedes bay, hands cleaned, notebook under her arm. She stopped when she saw Nora. "What are you working on?" she said. "Fractions," Nora said. "I already know them." "She does," Elias said. "What's the problem then?" Simone said. "There's no problem," Nora said. "That's the problem. I want a harder problem." Simone set her notebook on the bench and looked at the worksheet. She pulled a pencil from behind her ear. "What do you know about ratio and proportion?" she said. Nora looked at her. "What's that?" "It's what fractions are for," Simone said. "When you're using them on something real." She pulled up a stool. "Let me show you something." Elias cleaned the last tool and put it in the cabinet and stood for a moment watching Simone show Nora how the needle jet specification worked as a ratio, fuel to air, calibrated by the size of the jet opening, adjustable by the needle position, and how the altitude correction was fundamentally a proportional adjustment, a ratio problem. He watched Nora's face go from the polite patience of someone waiting to be interested to the engaged intensity of someone who is interested, the shift that happened when abstract became concrete, when fractions became the thing that made the engine run right. He put the last tool away and closed the cabinet. He went and stood beside the workbench, and the 3 of them sat together in Bay 9 in the low light of a January afternoon, the notebook open between Nora and Simone, the pencil moving across the page, the equations building toward something Nora was beginning to see. And Elias watched the knowledge moving and felt the particular completeness of that. Not the engine running, not the car restored, not the article published or the letter sent or the shop unlocked, but this, right now, the thing passing from one person to the next in the oldest way it had ever passed, hand to hand, one patient explanation at a time, one question asked and answered, and then the next question, the whole long, slow work of it continuing as it had always continued, as it would continue after him in the hands of people who didn't yet know what they were carrying. Nora wrote something in her purple notebook and looked up at him. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. I think I understand what right sounds like now." He looked at her. He thought about what she meant and what she'd been watching and listening to and absorbing for 6 years on the Thursdays and the ordinary days and the days in the Loire Valley shop and the days at the workbench. And he thought about his grandfather saying, "Tell me what your fingers are finding," and then listening without interrupting, the way you listen when you understand that what comes back might be something real. He said, "Tell me." She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that precedes something considered, not performed. "It sounds," she said, "like it knows what it's supposed to do." He stood at the workbench in Bay 9 with his daughter and the woman he was teaching and the notebooks and the tools and the 47 cars in the building around them. And outside the January light was going, the sky over the hills going from pale to dark the way it went in winter, fast and without ceremony. And inside the vault, the temperature held at 58 degrees. And the climate system breathed its constant breath, and everything that was supposed to be preserved was being preserved. And Elias Moreau looked at his daughter and understood that she had said the most accurate thing he had ever heard anyone say about this work, and that she had said it because she had been listening, the way he had asked her to listen, the way his grandfather had asked him to listen, the way the knowledge itself had always asked to be received, with patience, with time, with hands that never forgot what they were for. "Yes," he said, "that was exactly what right sounded like. It sounded like something that knew what it was supposed to do." And after all the years and all the silence and all the ordinary Thursdays that had added up to this one, in this place, with these people, Elias finally understood that the same was true of him.